Every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, I would begin my shift as the night watchman of a large property. The property was not just a big building, but also encompassed approximately 50 acres of land. I always found the job to be peaceful, despite the eerie silence that enveloped the property at night. The property was located in a secluded area, surrounded by fields and woods. While it was not too far from a subdivision, it still felt isolated and cut off from the rest of the world. The long driveway that led up to the main building only added to the secluded feel of the property. It was gated, and I would have to get out of my car every night to unlock and lock it back up. One night, as I began my rounds, I stepped out of the front door of the building, which was well lit and welcoming. As soon as I locked the door behind me, I heard a woman's voice scream, "Oh my God, somebody please help me!" The voice was faint, but it was unmistakably coming from up at the end of the driveway. My heart raced as I stood there, frozen in place. The scream had taken me by surprise, and I wasn't sure what to do. I took 5 running steps into the driveway before skidding to a stop and rushing back inside to call the police. The police responded quickly, with multiple police cars and even a helicopter. They searched the property thoroughly but found absolutely nothing. There was no sign of anyone in distress, and there were no signs of any suspicious activity. I still don't know what that scream was, but I can't shake the feeling that it was something sinister. I can't help but think that someone was trying to lure me out there. Maybe they wanted to hurt me, or maybe they wanted to steal something from the property. I don't know, and I probably never will. That night changed me. I became more paranoid, always looking over my shoulder and expecting the worst. I started carrying a flashlight with me on my rounds, just in case I needed to defend myself. I also made sure to keep my phone close at hand, in case I needed to call for help again. Despite my fears, I continued to work as the night watchman. I didn't want to let the unknown screamer win. I refused to let them scare me away from my job. But the incident had shaken me to my core, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen. I tried to brush it off as just paranoia, but I couldn't help the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. I decided to do some research on the property, just to see if there was anything suspicious about its history. I stumbled upon an old news article from several years ago, about a woman who had gone missing in the area. The article mentioned that the woman had last been seen on the property, near the end of the driveway. My heart raced as I read the article. Could the scream that I had heard belong to that missing woman? Was she still out there, somewhere on the property, calling out for help? I knew that I needed to find out. I couldn't let the mystery of the scream remain unsolved. I decided to do some investigating on my own, during my next shift. I waited until the middle of the night, when the property was at its most silent. I grabbed my flashlight and phone, and headed out to the end of the driveway. As I walked, I kept my eyes peeled for any signs of movement. I listened carefully for any sounds that seemed out of place. But all was silent, and I saw nothing. I reached the end of the driveway, where I had heard the scream. I shone my flashlight around, searching for any clues. I noticed a faint footprint in the dirt, and my heart leaped into my throat. Could it belong to the missing woman? I took a picture of the footprint with my phone and continued my search. But as I looked around, I realized that there was nothing else to see. I was just chasing ghosts. Despite my disappointment, I knew that I had done everything that I could. I had tried to solve the mystery, but it seemed that it was not meant to be. I finished my shift and went home, feeling both relieved and disappointed. The next day, I contacted the local police department and shared my findings with them. They were intrigued by the footprint, but they couldn't be sure if it belonged to the missing woman. They promised to look into it further, but I knew that the case was probably never going to be solved. I continued to work as the night watchman, always alert for any signs of danger. But the mystery of the scream remained unsolved, and I had no choice but to accept it. Months passed, and the scream became just a distant memory. I continued to work my shift, never forgetting what had happened that one night. One day, I received a call from the police department. They had found the missing woman, alive and well. She had been living in a nearby town all this time, and had no idea that anyone was looking for her. I was shocked by the news. I couldn't believe that the missing woman had been found, after all this time. I felt a sense of relief, knowing that she was safe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the scream that I had heard had nothing to do with the missing woman. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't explain it any other way. I continued to work as the night watchman, always on the lookout for danger. But the mystery of the scream remained just that, a mystery. And yet, every now and then, I would hear that faint scream in my head, as if it was trying to tell me something. I knew that I would never be able to forget it, no matter how hard I tried. Looking back on my experience as a night watchman, I realized that the job had taught me a lot about fear and the unknown. I had faced my fears and had come out the other side, stronger and wiser. I also realized that some mysteries were never meant to be solved, and that was okay. The scream that I had heard that night was still a mystery, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I had faced my fear and had come out victorious. And so, I continued to work as the night watchman, always ready for whatever came my way. The property was still secluded, and still had its fair share of mysteries. But I was up for the challenge, and I was ready to face whatever came my way. In the end, the experience had changed me. I was no longer the same person that I had been before. I was stronger, wiser, and more alert. I had faced my fears and had come out on top. And as I walked my rounds that night, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. I wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. I was ready for anything that the property could throw my way. And so, I continued my shift, feeling more confident than ever before. I knew that there would always be mysteries, but I was ready to face them head on. Bring it on, I thought to myself, as I continued my rounds. I was the night watchman, and I was ready for anything. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting the security office in a sterile, bluish glow. I slouched back in my chair, the worn leather groaning in protest. 12:07 a.m. My partner, Tony, had called out sick, a nasty flu bug making the rounds, apparently. So here I was, manning the fourth solo for the next 6 hours. Not ideal, but I'd done it before. The silence was almost oppressive. Normally, Tony's booming laugh or off-key humming would fill the void, but tonight, it was just me, the rhythmic hum of the servers, and the endless flicker of the security monitors. It was a small company, a tech startup trying to make it big, their headquarters tucked away in a nondescript building in Midtown Manhattan. On a good day, they had maybe 30 employees bustling around. Tonight, it was just a ghost town. The first hour dragged by, punctuated only by the occasional sip of lukewarm coffee and the rustling of the free donut bag, Tony's parting gift before succumbing to the flu. I was halfway through a particularly thrilling article about fire safety regulations when a flicker on one of the monitors caught my eye. It was subtle, a shadow shifting near the end of the main hallway. I leaned closer, squinting at the grainy image. Probably just a rat, I muttered to myself, feeling foolish for even entertaining the thought of an intruder. This wasn't exactly a high-security facility. Still, a prickle of unease ran down my spine. I rewound the footage, playing it back in slow motion. Nope, definitely nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks in the dead of night. But then, 10 minutes later, another flicker. This time closer, clearer. It was definitely a human silhouette, moving with a strange urgency toward the executive wing. I sat bolt upright, adrenaline jolting through me. This wasn't a drill. Someone was inside the building. My hand trembled as I reached for the walkie-talkie, the plastic cold against my clammy palm. "Tony, you there?" "Over," I whispered, my voice thin and reedy. Only static crackled back. Of course. He was at home, battling fever dreams and probably cursing the day he agreed to split a stale sandwich with me last week. I was alone. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat urging me to action. Protocol dictated I called the police first, but something held me back. What if it was just a drunk employee who'd locked himself out? Calling the cops on some poor schmuck who'd fallen asleep on his keyboard seemed excessive. Besides, what if it wasn't? What if it was someone dangerous? Waiting for the police felt like an eternity I couldn't afford. Swallowing hard, I grabbed my heavy-duty Maglite flashlight, the cold metal a reassuring weight in my hand. My stomach churned with a potent cocktail of fear and adrenaline. This was it. This was the moment they didn't prepare you for in security guard training. The hallway stretched before me, an abyss of flickering fluorescent lights and deepening shadows. My footsteps echoed with unnerving loudness in the silence, each one amplifying the frantic pounding in my chest. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the walls, momentarily blinded by the reflected glare. And then I heard it, a sharp, deafening crack that reverberated through the empty hallway. A gunshot. My blood ran cold. Panic clawed at my throat, threatening to overwhelm me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn tail and run, to get the hell out of there. But a sense of duty, a ludicrous sense of responsibility, rooted me to the spot. The gunshot had come from the end of the hallway, emanating from the president's office. I moved slowly, cautiously, each step heavy with dread. The faint glow from the office light spilled into the hallway, illuminating a thin sliver of the carpeted floor. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, my breath catching in my throat. The metal was surprisingly warm to the touch. I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the groan of the hinges. The scene that greeted me was seared into my memory, a horrifying tableau I knew would haunt me forever. The president, Mr. Davis, a man who always had a kind smile and a firm handshake, sat slumped in his leather chair. His head was tilted back at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring vacantly at the ceiling. A dark stain bloomed on his crisp white shirt, spreading like a macabre work of art. A gun lay on the floor, gleaming under the harsh office light. My stomach lurched, and I stumbled back, bow rising in my throat. I clapped a hand over my mouth, barely stifling a scream. His face, the emptiness in his eyes, the finality of it all washed over me in a sickening wave. The smell hit me then, the metallic tang of blood mingling with the stale scent of gunpowder. My legs turned to jelly, and I sank to the floor, my back against the wall, the cold seeping through my thin uniform shirt. Everything after that was a blur. I vaguely remember fumbling for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. I remember the sirens, the flashing lights, the flurry of activity as paramedics and police officers swarmed the building. I remember answering their questions, my voice a hoarse whisper, my words tumbling over each other in my haste to get the story out. I was put on paid leave immediately, a small mercy in the face of such a tragedy. The next few weeks were a haze of sleepless nights, recurring nightmares, and the bitter taste of guilt clinging to the back of my throat. I couldn't shake the image of Mr. Davis, the life draining from his eyes. The gunshot echoed in my ears, a constant reminder of that night. The official investigation revealed that Mr. Davis had been battling severe depression, driven to despair by mounting business pressures and a recent personal tragedy. It was a stark reminder that behind the polished facades of success and ambition, darkness could lurk, unseen and insidious. I eventually returned to work, to the same sterile office, the same flickering monitors. But something had changed. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was heavy, pregnant with unseen horrors. Every creak of the building, every flicker of light, sent a jolt of fear through me. 12 years have passed, but the memory of that night, the sight of Mr. Davis in that chair, remains etched in my mind. The nightmares come less frequently now, but they still linger in the shadows, waiting for the moment when my guard is down, ready to drag me back to that hallway, back to that office, back to the echo of that single, fatal gunshot. When I used to work overnights in retail, the world felt like a different place. It wasn't just the quiet, the emptiness, or the way the fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the shadows. It was a feeling, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made my skin crawl, a prickling awareness of something off. I was 20 then, fresh out of college and struggling to make ends meet. The graveyard shift at a big box store seemed like a good way to make some extra cash. Little did I know, it would be an experience I'd never forget, not for the money, but for the strange occurrences that pushed the boundaries of my sanity. The first few weeks were uneventful. I found myself oddly enjoying the silence, the solitude of the vast, empty aisles, the gentle hum of the refrigerators in the back. I learned the store's layout like the back of my hand, its secrets whispered in the stillness. There was a quiet beauty in the pre-dawn light that seeped through the windows, painting the aisles in soft hues of lavender and pink. One night, however, the quiet was shattered. I was restocking shelves in the home decor section when I heard it, a rattling, almost hysterical, sound coming from the emergency exit. It was like someone was shaking the door with all their might, a desperate, frantic energy that sent chills down my spine. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I was alone, my coworker, Jake, was in the back, working on the inventory. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. Maybe a stray wind? A raccoon trying to get in? But the sound was too deliberate, too intense for something so mundane. I swallowed hard, trying to quell the rising panic. I needed to tell Jake, but the thought of walking through the empty aisles, the shadows stretching long and distorted by the harsh fluorescent lights, was unbearable. I forced myself to move, my steps echoing in the cavernous space, each one a testament to my growing fear. I found Jake in the stockroom, a pile of boxes surrounding him. He looked up, startled, as I burst through the door. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice tense. "The emergency exit," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "It's rattling, like someone's trying to get in." Jake's eyebrows furrowed. "Are you sure? Maybe it's just the wind." But I knew it wasn't. The sound was too insistent, too terrifyingly real. We walked back to the front together, our steps echoing in the vast emptiness. The rattling became louder, more frantic, as we approached the emergency exit. I could practically feel the vibration in the air. Reaching the door, we both froze. The sound was almost deafening. We exchanged a look, our faces pale in the harsh white light. Fear, raw and primal, pulsed through us. Jake, ever the pragmatist, tried the handle. It was locked. "Maybe we should call security," he suggested, his voice a shaky whisper. We hurried to the security phone, our hands trembling. We reported the incident, our voices barely above a choked whisper. The security guard, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, listened, then dismissed our concern. "Probably just the wind, kids," he said dismissively. "Nothing to worry about." He hung up before we could protest. We stood there, staring at the phone, our fear hardening into something akin to disbelief. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We wait," Jake said, his voice tight. "Maybe it'll stop." We waited. The rattling continued, relentless and terrifying. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock amplifying our fear. Finally, the sound started to fade, slowly at first, then more quickly until it disappeared completely. We stood there, staring at the door, our hearts pounding in our chests. The security guard never came. We never learned what caused the rattling. It remained a haunting memory, a whisper of the unknown that clung to us long after we left the store. The next day, at work, the atmosphere felt different. The store seemed to hold its breath, the silence more profound, the shadows deeper. Jake and I exchanged nervous glances, each of us silently acknowledging the invisible weight that hung over us. But life, as it often does, moved on. The incident faded into a distant memory, a spooky tale shared amongst the graveyard shift crew. Then, one night, I was alone on the floor, doing inventory in the electronics section. The silence was thick, almost tangible. I was lost in the monotony of counting headphones and memory cards when I felt it. A tap on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see Jake, but there was no one there. The aisle was empty, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerators in the back. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was alone, completely alone in the vast emptiness of the store. I shook my head, trying to rationalize the sensation. Maybe I was just tired, my senses playing tricks on me. But the feeling lingered, a cold, clammy touch that sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around again, my gaze sweeping over the empty aisles, the shadows lengthening, the silence deepening. There was nothing there. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. My mind was playing tricks on me. But deep inside I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong, something was off. I was not alone. As the night wore on, the feeling intensified. I felt watched, followed, like there was an unseen presence in the store with me. The shadows seemed to move, the silence to whisper secrets. My skin crawled, my senses on high alert. I found myself checking over my shoulder every few minutes, my gaze searching the empty aisles, the shadows, the corners, as if afraid of what I might see. The night stretched into an eternity. The hours passed in a blur of anxiety and fear. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I left the store, my mind racing, the feeling of being watched still clinging to me like a shadow. I never went back to the graveyard shift at that store. I couldn't bring myself to face the silence, the shadows, the feeling that I was not alone. I found another job, one that didn't involve working in the dead of night, one that didn't leave me feeling haunted. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows long, I can still feel it, the touch on my shoulder, the unseen presence watching me. And I wonder what truly happened those nights, in that empty store, under the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights. Was it just my imagination, or was there something else lurking in the shadows, something unseen, something that whispered secrets in the silence of the night? I still don't know. And maybe it's better that way. Months later, I was browsing through the classifieds when I saw it. A job opening at a new retail store, right in the heart of the city. The hours were daytime, the pay decent, and the location convenient. It was the perfect job. I wasn't looking for a graveyard shift, but I was curious, almost compelled to see what it was like. It had been a while since I'd worked retail, and the experience at the old store had faded into a distant memory, a cautionary tale I told myself. I was nervous on my first day. The new store was modern, sleek, with bright lights and wide, open spaces. The atmosphere was completely different from the old store, a world away from the shadowed aisles and the silence that pressed down on you like a suffocating blanket. I was assigned to the electronics section, a vast, open space filled with the latest gadgets and gizmos. The days flew by, a blur of unpacking boxes, stocking shelves, and assisting customers. It was busy, fast-paced, and there was a constant buzz of energy that kept me alert. I was enjoying the shift. It had been a long time since I'd felt truly comfortable in a work environment. The people I worked with were friendly, the customers lively, and the atmosphere upbeat. But the nights, they were different. The store closed at 10, and the night crew, a small team of security guards and cleaning staff, took over. I had no reason to stay, but I found myself drawn back to the store, almost as if I were compelled by an unseen force. The first time I went back, it was just curiosity. The store was quiet, the lights dimmed, the air thick with the smell of cleaning supplies. I wandered the aisles, taking in the emptiness, the silence. It was strange. It felt different. It had the same sterile, modern feel as during the day, but there was an undercurrent of something else, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made my skin prickle. I couldn't quite place it, but it was unsettling. The second time, it was the same. I found myself drawn back to the store, compelled to experience the stillness, the emptiness, the feeling of being alone in the vast space. I was alone, but I didn't feel alone. I began to feel a presence, a whisper in the silence, a touch on the back of my neck, a cold draft of air, a shift in the shadows. I knew it was nothing, just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to ignore it. I focused on the work, the cleaning, the inventory, but the feeling lingered, a persistent, gnawing sense of unease. One night, I was finishing up the stockroom, the last one left in the store. The silence was heavy, the air thick with the smell of cleaning supplies. I was about to leave when I heard it. A rattling. It was faint at first, a barely audible sound, like a loose piece of metal rattling against something hard. I stopped, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from the back of the store, near the service entrance. I tried to rationalize it. It was probably just the wind, or a loose piece of plumbing. But I knew it wasn't. The sound was deliberate, almost frantic, like someone was trying to get in. Fear gripped me. I remembered the emergency exit at the old store, the rattling sound, the feeling of being watched. The memories flooded back, vivid and terrifying. I stood frozen, torn between running and staying put. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, a logical solution. The sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the service entrance, locked and bolted. I knew I should call security, but I couldn't move. Fear had me paralyzed. Then I saw it. A shadow. It flickered across the wall, a fleeting glimpse of something dark and formless moving in the dim light. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to send a wave of terror through me. I ran. I ran out of the store, my heart pounding, my breath ragged. I didn't stop until I was far away, the lights of the city a blur of color in my vision. As I walked home, I tried to rationalize what I had seen, to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the light. But I knew it wasn't. I never went back to that store. I quit the job the next day, leaving a note of resignation on my desk. I couldn't face the darkness, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. I knew then that I'd never be able to work the night shift again. The experience had left me permanently scarred, forever haunted by the memory of the rattling sound, the flickering shadow, the feeling of being watched. And I'm left with a question, a nagging suspicion, a whisper in the silence that haunts me to this day. Was it just my imagination, or was there something else lurking in the shadows, something unseen, something that whispered secrets in the silence of the night? I work night shift at a rehab facility. Not the glamorous kind, mind you. This place is tucked away in a part of town where the streetlights flicker nervously, and the only sounds at night are the distant sirens and the occasional drunken brawl. It's the kind of place where you learn to keep your head down and your wits about you. We've got a protected gate, a camera looking down from above, and one of those doorbell cameras. In the office, the camera monitor is on one wall, and the doorbell monitor is on another. The nights are usually quiet. I'd spend most of my time doing paperwork, catching up on emails, and occasionally checking in on the residents. Maybe a walk around the grounds to make sure everything was secure. It's not exactly action-packed, but it's a job. It pays the bills, and it keeps me off the streets at night. Then there was that night. I remember it like it was yesterday. I'd been working on some paperwork, lost in the monotonous world of insurance forms and patient records. It was a Tuesday night, a little after midnight. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old building. My gaze drifted towards the camera monitors, the usual stillness of the night mirrored in the screens. And then I saw him. He was just a silhouette at first, a shadow moving through the harsh glare of the streetlights. He walked past the gate, a casual stroll that seemed to carry a weight of its own. Then he stopped, just a few feet from the camera. He paused, a brief hesitation, and then slowly turned around. He walked back towards the camera, his movements deliberate, and stared straight up at the lens. His eyes held me. I'm not easily startled. I've seen my fair share of shady characters in this neighborhood, and I'm used to folks hanging around the gate, looking for trouble, or just a place to get out of the rain. But the way this guy was staring, it was different. There was an intensity to it, a fixated focus that sent a shiver down my spine. His eyes were hollow, the whites of them almost unnaturally white. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, someone who was lost in a world that was too dark and too real. His expression was emotionless, vacant, as if he were in deep thought about something horrible, something deeply unsettling. I was pretty sure he was zonked on synthetics. His movements were sluggish, his gaze unwavering, and there was a strange stillness about him, like a broken doll frozen in a perpetual stare. I used the intercom to see if he was okay. My voice echoed through the speakers, a small tremor running through it. "Hello? Can I help you?" He didn't respond. He just kept staring, unblinking, directly at the camera. I waited for a reaction, for him to acknowledge me, to move away, to do anything. But he remained frozen, his hollow eyes locked on my face through the lens. We had a rule at the facility. If someone wasn't hurting themselves or trying to come through the fence, we just let them be. No sense in engaging needlessly with somebody potentially hostile or, worse, ****ing with the locals. We didn't want to provoke anyone, especially not in this part of town. So I decided to ignore him. I sat back down at my desk, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But the image of his vacant gaze, the unsettling silence of his stare, kept replaying in my mind. I tried to focus on my paperwork, but the image of his eyes, those hollow, lifeless orbs, seemed to permeate everything. I kept finding myself glancing at the camera monitor, hoping that he had moved on, but he was still there, staring. I continued to work, trying to ignore the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. It felt like he was looking right through the monitor, right into my soul. Time seemed to slow down. The clock on the wall ticked away, each second feeling like an eternity. Then came the moment I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was the silent scream in the dead of night. Exactly 2 hours had passed since he had first appeared. I looked at the camera monitor, and there he was, in the same spot, staring at me. The same vacant, dead-eyed stare, unchanging, unwavering. My heart hammered in my chest. It was one thing to ignore a strange guy in the street, but 2 hours of that hollow gaze was pushing the limit. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to break free from the clutches of his unnerving stare. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and let this go on. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some local thug high on drugs. This was something else, something sinisterly wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of my office, walking towards the front entrance. I needed to see if he was still there. I needed to know if he was real, or if this was some kind of horrifying hallucination. As I approached the gate, the lights cast long, distorted shadows on the pavement. I tried to ignore the feeling of dread that was starting to overwhelm me. But when I got to the gate, he was gone. The spot where he had been standing was empty. There was no sign of him, no trace of his presence. And it was then, in that moment of eerie silence, that the real terror hit me. It wasn't the fact that he was gone. It was the fact that he was gone without a trace. He had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a chilling silence and a lingering sense of unease. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had been, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no logic to it, no explanation. I went back into the office, still shaken to the core. I looked at the camera monitor, hoping for some sign, some clue, some evidence that what I had seen was real. But the screen was empty. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being followed. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves seemed to hold the potential for his return. I tried to focus on my work, but the image of his hollow eyes kept flashing in my mind, like a persistent phantom. I kept replaying the scene over and over, trying to find some rational explanation, some logical answer. But there was none. The next day, I told my colleagues about what I had seen. They listened intently, their faces etched with concern. "That sounds really creepy," one of them said, his voice low. "But maybe he was just on something. They do that sometimes, you know, stare into space. Lost in their own world." But his words did little to ease my unease. I knew that what I had seen was something more than just a drug-addled guy. I tried to put it out of my mind, but it was too late. The image of his hollow stare, the chilling silence of his presence, had burrowed into the recesses of my mind, leaving behind a lingering sense of dread. And that's the thing about some experiences, you know? They're not about the things you see, but the way they make you feel. They leave a mark, a scar on your soul, that even time can't fully heal. I never saw him again. But I never forgot him either. For months after that night, I kept checking the camera monitors, looking for any sign of him, any flicker of his hollow stare. But he was gone, vanished without a trace. I've since moved on to a different job, one where the nights are quieter, the shadows less ominous. But I still think about him sometimes, about the way he stood there, staring at me, his hollow eyes filled with an empty void that I can't shake. And I still wonder what he was looking at, what he was thinking, what he was waiting for. Because I know, somewhere out there, in the darkness of the endless night, he's still watching. He's always watching. I work the graveyard shift. It's a quiet job, mostly. Or at least, it's supposed to be. The stillness of the night is supposed to be my only companion as I make my rounds, checking on patients, administering medication, filling out endless charts. But sometimes, the night shifts up its own brand of surprises. And sometimes, those surprises stay with you long after the sun rises. This particular night, it began like any other. I was on my third cup of coffee, the bitter liquid a poor substitute for sleep but doing its best to keep me alert. The clock on the wall ticked past 3 a.m., the witching hour, some would call it. Right on cue, the phone on my desk buzzed, a shrill sound that broke the silence with almost violent urgency. Dispatch to Unit 12. A voice crackled on the other end. Possible seizure, potentially drug-related. Address is... I jotted down the details, my hand moving on autopilot as the dispatcher droned on. An address in a neighborhood known for its transient residents, its cheap rentals attracting a mix of students, struggling artists, and recent immigrants still finding their footing in the city. It wasn't an area known for its peace and quiet, but drug overdoses, while tragic, weren't exactly uncommon either. What was uncommon was the urgency in the dispatcher's voice. Police are already en route, she continued, her usually bored tone laced with an edge of uncertainty. Situation unknown. Proceed with caution. That gave me pause. Situation unknown. Those two words hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. I grabbed my kit, the weight of it familiar and reassuring, and headed out into the night. The address led me to a rundown apartment building, its facade peeling paint a testament to years of neglect. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettlingly unfamiliar. 2 police cruisers were already parked haphazardly outside, their flashing lights painting the street in alternating stripes of red and blue. As I approached the building, 2 officers, their faces drawn and pale in the strobing lights, emerged, ushering a young woman outside. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her words tumbling out in a torrent of Spanish that I could barely follow. One of the officers, a burly man with tired eyes, caught my glance. "Paramedic?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Yes, sir," I replied, flashing my ID. "What's the situation?" "Inside," he said, jerking his head towards the building. "Her friend. Not sure what's wrong with her, but it ain't drugs. At least, not the kind we usually see." He didn't elaborate, but the look on his face told me this wasn't going to be a routine call. I entered the apartment, my senses immediately assaulted by a wave of conflicting sensations, the cloying sweetness of incense battling with the pungent odor of bleach. In the center of the room, on a threadbare couch, lay a woman. She couldn't have been older than 40, yet there was a strange, ageless quality to her features. Her eyes, wide open, stared straight ahead, unseeing. I'd seen my fair share of dilated pupils in my line of work, but hers were different. They were completely black, the irises swallowed by the expanded pupils, leaving no trace of white. It was as if someone had taken a black marker and colored her eyes in, leaving a chillingly blank canvas where her gaze should have been. She was breathing, albeit shallowly, but otherwise completely unresponsive. I checked her pulse, noting that it was racing, her heart a frantic drum against my fingertips. She just started acting strange. The younger woman, who I assumed was the friend the police had spoken to, said, her voice thick with unshed tears. She spoke broken English, heavily accented with Spanish. She screamed, she moved like something not human. How long ago did this start? I asked, my voice deliberately calm, as much to reassure myself as her. Maybe an hour, maybe more, she said, her voice breaking. I call 911, but she never acted like this before. Has she taken anything? Any medication, drugs, alcohol? The woman shook her head. No, she no do drugs. Then, with a hesitant pause, she added, but in Colombia, twice, they have to exorcise her. Exorcise. The word hung in the air, heavy and cold, sending a shiver down my spine. I pushed down the rising sense of unease, reminding myself that I dealt with the tangible, the medical. Still, the woman's words, coupled with the strange stillness of the woman on the couch, and those unnervingly blank eyes, created a cocktail of apprehension that was difficult to ignore. Trying to maintain a semblance of professional detachment, I continued my examination. Her skin was clammy, and despite the cool night air, beads of sweat glistened on her forehead. Her muscles were incredibly tense, her entire body rigid. I had to use more force than I expected to bend her arm and check her reflexes, which were strangely exaggerated. And then it happened. The woman on the couch, still staring straight ahead, let out a scream. It was a sound that defied description, a guttural, animalistic howl that seemed to claw its way up from the depths of her being. It was a sound that spoke of pain, yes, but also of something else, something ancient and profoundly unsettling. As the echo of the scream faded, her body contorted. It wasn't a seizure, not like any I'd ever seen. Her entire body arched off the couch, her spine bending at an unnatural angle, her limbs twisting in directions they shouldn't. It was as if some unseen puppet master had cut her strings and then decided to play a macabre game with her body. The friend started sobbing in earnest, burying her face in her hands. Even the police officers, hardened veterans of countless grim scenes, exchanged uneasy glances. We got her onto the stretcher, which proved to be an ordeal in itself. Her body, normally pliant, was now as rigid as a board. It took all three of us, me and the two officers, to lift her. At one point, her hand lashed out, her nails raking across my cheek, leaving behind a burning scratch that stung more than it should have. The ride to the hospital was a blur of adrenaline and unease. Every few minutes the woman on the stretcher would erupt in another ear-splitting scream, her body twisting and contorting in impossible ways. I tried to focus on monitoring her vitals, on doing my job, but the rational part of my brain was losing ground to the primal fear that coiled in my gut. At the hospital, we rushed her into a treatment room. A team of doctors and nurses, alerted to the unusual arrival, swarmed around her, their faces a mixture of concern and bewilderment. As I relayed the details of the call, the woman on the table suddenly went silent. Her body, still rigid, relaxed slightly, and for a moment I thought whatever force had gripped her had finally released its hold. But then, her eyelids fluttered, and her eyes found mine. The pupils were still fully dilated, still an abyss of impenetrable black, but there was something different in their depths now. It wasn't pain, or fear, or even the blankness of unconsciousness. It was something else, something ancient and knowing, and it stared at me with a chilling intensity that sent a wave of primal terror crashing over me. I backed away, my heart pounding against my ribs, as the medical team, oblivious to my fear, continued their examinations. I watched as they ran test after test, each one coming back inconclusive. Eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, the attending physician, a man with a no-nonsense demeanor and a perpetually furrowed brow, approached me. "We're transferring her to the psych ward," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "There's something going on here. But it's not something we can treat in the ER. I nodded, relieved to have some distance from the woman with the black eyes. I watched as they wheeled her away, her body now eerily still, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the ceiling. I never saw her again. The scratch on my face healed within days, leaving behind a faint scar that served as a tangible reminder of that night. The memory, however, lingered, a disquieting echo in the quiet corners of my mind. I never spoke about that night, not to my colleagues, not to my friends, not even to my wife. How do you explain something that defies explanation, that challenges the very fabric of your understanding of the world? 15 years have passed, and still, the memory haunts me. Was it a psychotic break, brought on by the stress of immigration and a traumatic past? Or was it something else, something far more ancient and sinister, something that defied the neat categories of our modern world? The rational part of me, the part that clings to logic and science, wants to believe it was the former. But deep down, in the quiet hours of the night, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can't shake the feeling that I looked into the face of something other. And that feeling, like the faint scar on my cheek, is a chilling reminder that sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that remain unsolved. It was nearing 3 in the morning, the kind of hour where the world feels both impossibly quiet and unnaturally loud. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, casting a sterile glow over the cavernous space of the hardware store. It was a far cry from the bustling day, the aisles now deserted except for me and Mike, my coworker, hunched over a stack of our 30 insulation rolls. We were the night crew, tasked with the unglamorous but essential job of keeping the store running smoothly after the day crew clocked out. Tonight, our mission was to restock the insulation bay. Each roll was heavy, the fiberglass batting itching through the wrapping. Mike grumbled something about the uneven stacks and I just nodded, my mind already half drifting off to the warm cup of coffee I'd have in a few hours. We were in the middle of the task, Mike struggling to lift a particularly stubborn roll, when a sudden, icy fear gripped me. A hand, cold and clammy, shot out of the jumbled mess of insulation and clamped onto my arm. I screamed, a high-pitched, strangled sound that echoed through the empty store. Mike, startled, dropped his roll with a thud, his face pale with shock. "What the hell?" he yelled, backing away. Something grabbed me." I stuttered, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to pull my arm free, but the grip tightened, sending a jolt of pure terror through me. I stumbled back, dragging the insulation mess with me. It was then that I saw him, a figure huddled in the debris. He was an older man, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes glazed over with a disturbing blankness. His clothes were tattered and stained, and a strong, acrid smell of stale alcohol hung in the air around him. He was clearly drunk, well beyond the point of being able to function. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. How could he have been there? How could he have been hiding in the insulation? The questions tumbled through my head like a panicked avalanche. Mike, his initial shock giving way to a mixture of disgust and fear, slowly approached. "Dude, what the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice strained. He cautiously reached out, his hand hovering over the man's shoulder. As he did, the man's head snapped up, his eyes focusing on Mike for a fleeting moment before losing their focus again. He mumbled something incomprehensible, his voice a slurred rasp. The silence descended once more, heavy and thick. "We need to get him out of here," I finally said, my voice shaking. "He can't stay here." Mike nodded, but his face was frozen in a mask of apprehension. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at the man slumped against the insulation. The air was thick with the smell of alcohol, sweat, and something else, a pervasive, almost metallic odor that made my stomach churn. We were both too stunned to move, too overwhelmed by the sheer absurdity of the situation. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mike shifted his weight, his eyes darting between the man and the phone in his pocket. "We gotta call security," he said, his voice strained. "This is messed up." As he dialed the number, I couldn't help but think about how much this felt like a scene from a horror movie, the dead of night setting, the eerie silence, and the unexpected, unsettling figure lurking in the shadows. But this wasn't a movie. It was real, and it was terrifying. The security guard, a heavy-set man with a weary expression, arrived within minutes. He looked at the man, barely giving us a glance, and sighed. "Another one," he muttered, shaking his head. The guard, a seasoned veteran of the late-night shifts, knew the routine. He calmly approached the man, his voice soothing, his words carrying a strange blend of authority and empathy. He talked to the man as if he were a child, asking if he was okay, if he needed anything. The man, oblivious to the situation, simply mumbled incoherently, his eyes glazed over. The guard, after a brief consultation with his manager, called the police. It was clear to us that the man was far beyond help, lost in the depths of his own inebriation. The police arrived, 2 officers, their faces hardened by years of dealing with situations like this. They assessed the man, their expressions grim. They determined he was too intoxicated to be left on his own, and decided to take him into custody. As they led the man out of the store, I felt a strange mixture of relief and pity. Relief that he was finally being taken care of, pity for the man himself, for the life he had led that had brought him to this point. The officers left, the sound of their patrol car fading into the distance. The store fell silent once again, the air thick with the lingering stench of alcohol and fear. Mike and I stood there for a moment, the silence weighing heavily between us. We had both been shaken by the encounter, our usual banter replaced by a quiet, unspoken understanding. We had both seen something that night, something that had shaken us to our core. "I can't believe that actually happened," Mike said, his voice still a little shaky. "I mean, how did he even get in here? It's locked up tight after hours." I shrugged, my mind still reeling from the events of the past few hours. "I don't know. I guess he must have snuck in some time before we got here." We returned to our work, the insulation rolls seeming heavier than ever. But a part of me, a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind, couldn't shake the feeling that the man, the drunkard, was still there, somehow lurking in the shadows. The hours stretched on, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. The silence of the empty store, which had once been comforting, now felt oppressive, the fluorescent lights casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the aisles. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of a plastic bag sent shivers down my spine. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the drunkard's gaunt face staring back at me. The night felt different now, the darkness no longer a reassuring blanket but a cold, menacing entity. The store, which had always been a haven of normalcy, had been irrevocably tainted by the encounter. As dawn finally broke, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, a sense of relief washed over me. The night, with its unsettling encounter, was finally over. But the memory of the man, his eyes glazed over, his body slumped against the insulation rolls, remained. It was a chilling reminder that the world, even in the most mundane of places, could hold a darkness that was both unexpected and terrifying. The next few weeks were a blur. I tried to forget about the encounter, but the image of the man's hand reaching out, his eyes filled with a strange, unsettling emptiness, kept resurfacing in my mind. I was always a little more cautious around the insulation bay after that. I found myself checking the shadows more often, looking for any sign of movement. The store, once a familiar and comforting place, now felt slightly off, its silence holding a new meaning. One day, a few months after the incident, I was walking down the aisle when I saw a figure sitting in a corner, hunched over, his head resting on his hands. My heart skipped a beat, my pulse quickening. For a moment, I froze, my mind racing back to that night, the terror, the helplessness. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't the man from that night. It was just a customer, taking a break, his head resting on his hands, his eyes closed. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't him, not this time. But the feeling of dread, the sense of unease that had settled in my heart that night, lingered. It was a reminder that the world, even in the most mundane of places, could hold a darkness that was both unexpected and terrifying. The encounter in the insulation bay had changed me. It had made me more aware of the shadows, more attuned to the unexpected. I learned that the world could be a strange and unsettling place, that even in the most ordinary of settings, fear could lurk just beneath the surface. And I also learned that sometimes, the most frightening things aren't the things that go bump in the night, but the things that dwell in the hearts and minds of people, lost and forgotten in the shadows of their own lives. Work in the winter for me is plowing and snow removal. It's a tough job, physically demanding, and often dangerous. But it's a job I've gotten used to, a rhythm I've learned to navigate. After a while, it becomes as natural as breathing the crunch of snow under the tires, the roar of the engine, the rhythmic swish of the snowplow blade. It's a world of its own in the winter, a world of white and gray, where the sun is a distant memory, and the only warmth comes from the engine of your truck. That night, the blizzard had been relentless. The snow was falling thick and fast, visibility was reduced to a few feet, and the wind was howling like a banshee. I'd been out for over 24 hours, my eyes burning, my body aching. I was exhausted, but the damned snow just wouldn't stop. I needed to get off the road, to catch a few minutes of sleep. I pulled into a small cul-de-sac, the nearest house a good 100 yards away. It wasn't the most ideal spot, but it was the best I could find in this thick snow. I left the engine running, the truck's massive V8 rumbling a comforting lullaby. The heat from the heater, a small island of warmth in the frigid cab, was enough to lull me into a state of semi-consciousness. Then it happened. A loud bang, like a gunshot, echoed through the cab. It felt like someone was pulling at my driver's side door handle. My heart leaped into my throat. I was instantly awake, adrenaline surging through my veins. Luckily, I always kept my truck doors locked. The sound of the bang still reverberated in my ears, leaving a ringing in my head. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped my gut. My mind raced through scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. Was someone trying to get in? Was it a wild animal, attracted by the warmth and the engine's rumble? What if it was someone who meant to harm me? I fumbled for the switch, throwing on every strobe light, the rear lights, the headlights, bathing the cul-de-sac in a blinding white light. I slammed the gear into drive, the truck's engine roaring back to life. I threw the truck into reverse, eyes glued to the side mirrors, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Silence. Except for the frantic beating of my heart. My eyes strained in the darkness, scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. I was convinced someone was watching me, hiding in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. My hand clutched the heavy metal lock on my door, my knuckles white with tension. I stayed in the cul-de-sac for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting back and forth, my senses on high alert. The snow was still coming down, blanketing everything in a thick white shroud. The wind howled, a chilling reminder of the isolation and vulnerability I felt in that moment. Finally, after what seemed like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, I decided to leave. I couldn't stay there, my fear was paralyzing me. I drove to the next parking lot, a brightly lit space in front of a strip mall, filled with the comforting hum of fluorescent lights. It felt like a sanctuary. I found a space, parked the truck, and slumped in the seat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands were trembling, my body shaking with the aftermath of the adrenaline rush. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been out there, lurking in the shadows. The bang, the feeling of someone trying to open my door, the chilling silence that followed, it all seemed so surreal, a nightmare brought to life. I watched the snow falling, the white flakes swirling in the headlights of passing cars. The world was a blur of white and gray, a stark contrast to the sudden burst of color from the brightly lit store windows. I was safe, for now, but the fear remained. It was a cold, persistent fear, a fear that lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow. I tried to reason with myself. It was probably just a branch falling against the truck, or maybe the wind slamming something against the door. It could have been anything, a trick of the mind, a figment of my exhausted state. But the feeling persisted, the doubt gnawing at me. I decided to head back to the depot, to get some rest. I needed to get off the road, to find some sense of normalcy. I couldn't keep driving around in this state of fear and anxiety. I needed to clear my head, to calm my nerves. The drive back was uneventful, the highway empty, the snow falling softly. I still felt a shiver run down my spine every time I saw a shadow in the distance, every time I heard a strange noise. But I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. I arrived back at the depot in the early hours of the morning. The place was deserted, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign above the gate. I parked the truck, shut off the engine, and stepped out into the cold. The snow was still falling, but the wind had died down, replaced by an eerie silence. The world was cloaked in a thick blanket of white, the trees standing bare and skeletal, their branches heavy with snow. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold air, trying to shake off the last vestiges of fear. I walked into the depot, the warm air enveloping me like a hug. I found a bunk in the back, threw myself down, and pulled the blankets over me. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the images of the cul-de-sac, the bang, the chilling silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I felt watched, as if someone or something was lurking outside, waiting for the right moment to strike. I kept my eyes shut, but I couldn't stop the fear from creeping through my mind, weaving its way into my dreams. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and exhausted. I went out to the truck, the fear still lingering in the back of my mind. I checked the doors, the windows, even the engine compartment, looking for any sign of intrusion, any trace of what had happened the night before. But there was nothing. I shrugged it off. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. I was tired, and the stress of the job was getting to me. I needed to take a break, to relax, to get away from the snow and the isolation of the winter. I finished my shift, and then went home, drove into my garage, and shut the door behind me. I locked the garage door, double-checked the locks, and then finally relaxed. I felt safe, secure, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home. But the fear was still there, a nagging sensation in the back of my mind. It was a fear I couldn't shake, a fear that would linger for days, weeks, months. I continued my work, plowing snow, hauling salt, battling the elements. I kept my truck doors locked, the windows rolled up, the headlights on. I avoided isolated spots, sticking to busy roads and well-lit parking lots. I told myself it was all in my head, that the experience in the cul-de-sac was just a fluke, a trick of the mind. But I couldn't escape the feeling that someone or something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I started sleeping with a flashlight by my bed, a baseball bat by the door. I checked the windows every night before going to bed, making sure they were locked. I took precautions, fearing that the event in the cul-de-sac was just the beginning, a harbinger of things to come. The fear became a part of my life, a constant shadow, a nagging voice in the back of my mind. It started to affect my work, my relationships, my life. I became withdrawn, irritable, jumpy. I couldn't relax, couldn't sleep, couldn't enjoy anything. One night, I was driving home from work, the roads slick with ice, the wind whipping through my hair. I was alone, the highway deserted, the snow falling thick and fast. I was feeling vulnerable, exposed, like a target. I thought of the cul-de-sac, the bang, the feeling of someone trying to open my door. I thought of the fear, the constant sense of being watched. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, that the fear was consuming me, destroying me. I needed help, needed to talk to someone. I looked at my phone, the screen reflecting the light of the passing cars. I hesitated for a moment, then dialed the number. It was a number I'd been carrying around in my wallet for months, a number for a therapist, a number I'd never dared to call before. I took a deep breath, and finally, I made the call. It was the beginning of my journey, a journey to face my fears and to reclaim my life. It was a journey that would take time, effort, and courage. But it was a journey I knew I had to take, for myself, for my sanity, for my future. The experience in the cul-de-sac changed me. It forced me to confront my fears, to confront the shadows that lurked in the corners of my mind. It taught me about resilience, about the importance of staying vigilant, about the power of human connection. It also taught me the importance of sleep, the importance of taking care of yourself, the importance of finding solace in the midst of the storm. The next time I found myself on the road, alone in the winter, the snow falling all around me, I knew I wouldn't be alone. I would be armed with the tools I needed to face my fears, to stay safe, to keep moving forward. And I would always remember the lessons I learned in the cul-de-sac, lessons that would forever shape my life. I used to work night shift as a care aide in an old folks' home. It was already creepy. The home was an old hospital that was converted. The walls were thick, the rooms were dim, and there was a constant, low hum that seemed to permeate every corner. It was the kind of place where you could practically feel the history seep into your pores, a history thick with both life and death. The residents themselves were a mix of the sweet, the grumpy, and the downright peculiar. There was Mrs. Jenkins, who would whisper stories of the spirit child she claimed lived in her room, and Mr. Peterson, who insisted on keeping his room perpetually dark and spoke of shadowy figures lurking in the corners. I always chalked it up to the age and the medications, but there was a distinct feeling of unease that lingered in the air like stale perfume. Then there was the incident. It started subtly, a rustling in the courtyard outside my window, the sound of a door creaking open and shutting in the dead of night. At first I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on my tired mind. But then I saw him. A figure cloaked in black, a bone-white skull mask chillingly illuminated by the faint glow of the moon, stood in the courtyard. He was tall and gaunt, with a scythe that gleamed menacingly in the dim light. He was the Grim Reaper, or at least, that's what he looked like. He moved with an unnerving grace, his footsteps silent on the cobblestones, his scythe scraping against the ground with a hollow, unsettling sound. He would walk from one door to another, knocking softly, lingering outside each room for a few moments, before moving on. I watched him, paralyzed by fear, as he crept towards Mrs. Jenkins' room. She was frail, barely clinging to life, and the sight of the Grim Reaper standing outside her door sent a wave of panic through me. I sprang into action, grabbing the first thing I could find, a heavy, brass candlestick, and ran out to confront him. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" He didn't respond. He simply turned towards me, his skull mask glinting in the moonlight, and raised his scythe. There was a horrifying silence, broken only by the rustle of the wind and the frantic beating of my heart. I stood frozen, my hand clutching the candlestick, fear gripping me like a vice. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished. The courtyard was empty, the only evidence of his presence the lingering chill in the air and the cold sweat that had soaked my clothes. I rushed to Mrs. Jenkins' room, my heart pounding in my chest. She was asleep, her breathing shallow, her face peaceful. He hadn't entered. He hadn't done anything. But the fear stayed with me, a persistent shadow that followed me everywhere. The next night, he was back. The rustle in the courtyard, the hollow scrape of the scythe, the figure in the moonlight. I watched him again, this time armed with a flashlight, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He again lingered outside Mrs. Jenkins' room, then moved to Mr. Peterson's. This time, I saw his eyes, two dark, empty sockets that stared through me, devoid of any emotion. He was a phantom, a specter that appeared and disappeared at will, a constant reminder of mortality that haunted the halls of the old hospital. Each night, he would wander the courtyard, a silent, chilling presence that instilled a primal fear in the hearts of everyone who saw him. I couldn't tell anyone what I saw. They would dismiss it as my imagination running wild, the stress of the job getting to me. But I knew what I saw. I knew he was real, and I knew that he was dangerous. The nights became unbearable. I slept with the lights on, my hand always reaching for the candlestick. Every rustle, every creak, sent me scrambling to grab my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. The residents started to notice him too. They would whisper about the black figure that appeared in the courtyard, the man with the scythe that they saw outside their windows. I tried to reassure them, to tell them it was their imaginations, but even I couldn't convince myself anymore. The fear was growing, seeping into every corner of the home. It was palpable, suffocating, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. Then, one night, I saw him again. He was standing outside Mrs. Jenkins' room, his scythe raised, his dark eyes fixed on her. This time, I couldn't stand it. I ran outside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, my heart screaming in my chest. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "Leave her alone! This is not your place!" He didn't move. He simply stood there, his skull mask a chillingly silent presence in the moonlight. Then I saw him move, not towards me, but towards the old, cracked well in the corner of the courtyard. He disappeared down the well, leaving behind a faint, ghostly whisper that echoed through the night. The moment he disappeared, a sense of calm washed over me. The fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks subsided. I felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from my chest. I stood there for a long time, the flashlight beam still pointed toward the well, my heart gradually returning to a normal rhythm. Then, I slowly walked back to the home, the fear replaced by a strange sense of relief. The next day, I reported the incident to the director. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable, before dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "Just stress, dear," he said. "You need to take a break. A week off should do you good." He didn't believe me, but I knew he couldn't deny the growing unease among the staff and the residents. A few days later, a security guard was hired, a burly man with a gruff demeanor and a watchful eye. The Grim Reaper didn't return. He vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind a chilling legacy of fear and unease. But for me, the experience changed everything. It opened my eyes to the unseen world, the world of shadows and specters, a world that exists just beyond the veil of our perception. I left the home a few months later, the memories of the Grim Reaper etched permanently in my mind. I never told anyone about the well, about the ghostly whisper that had echoed through the night. It was a secret I carried with me, a reminder of the unsettling encounter that had shaken me to my core. I still work with the elderly, but I never do night shifts anymore. The fear, the unease, the haunting memories, they all linger in my mind, a constant reminder of the night the Grim Reaper visited the old folks' home. The home itself still stands, a testament to a bygone era, its walls whispering tales of life, death, and the unseen. I often wonder about the Grim Reaper, about his purpose, about the message he was trying to convey. Did he come to warn us, to remind us of our own mortality? Or was he just a figment of our collective imagination, a manifestation of our deepest fears? I don't know the answer, and I doubt I ever will. But one thing is certain, the experience changed me, forever altering my perception of the world and my place in it. It made me more aware of the fragility of life, the fleeting nature of time, and the inevitability of death. And every now and then, when I'm alone in the darkness, I hear a faint, ghostly whisper, a chilling reminder of the night the Grim Reaper visited the old folks' home. The laughter woke me. It wasn't just any laughter, it was a manic, echoing cackle that seemed to reverberate off the ancient beams of our old house. I sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't a friendly laugh, it was evil. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The room was plunged in darkness, only a faint moonbeam filtering through the window. Silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall. Then, it started again. The cackling laughter, louder now, closer. My eyes darted to the door, to the attic hatch that led up to the dusty, forgotten space above our heads. "What was that?" Mom whispered from the bed next to me. Dad, usually the epitome of calm, was already out of bed, his silhouette stark against the moonlight. "I don't know, but—" He trailed off, his voice tight. The laughter stopped abruptly. We held our breath, listening, waiting. "It's coming from the attic," Dad said, his voice a low rumble. He moved towards the attic hatch, his hand reaching for the old rope ladder that hung down from the opening. "Don't!" Mom cried, her voice laced with fear. "Don't go up there." But Dad was already pulling the ladder down, his face grim. He cast a glance at us, a silent reassurance, and started climbing the rickety steps. We huddled in the silence, listening to the creaking of the ladder and the muffled thump of Dad's footsteps. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten memories. Dust-covered boxes overflowed with old photographs, moth-eaten clothes, and forgotten toys. An old gramophone, its horn missing, sat forlornly in a corner. A collection of chipped teacups were stacked precariously on a dusty shelf. I could see Dad's flashlight beam dancing across the attic as he explored. The silence, broken only by the rhythmic creaking of the old house, was deafening. Then, a sudden gasp. "Oh my God!" Dad exclaimed. His voice was hushed, but the shock in it was palpable. "What is it?" I whispered, my heart hammering. We waited, holding our breath, listening. It's an alarm clock," Dad said, his voice trembling. "A Dairy cow alarm clock. But it's making that noise." He descended the ladder, his face drawn and white. In his hand he held a small, plastic, yellow and red alarm clock, the iconic image of a grinning Dairy cow emblazoned on its face. It was a relic of my childhood, a gift from a long-forgotten family holiday. He switched off the alarm, the manic laughter instantly silenced. It's just a faulty alarm clock," he said, his voice almost a whisper. But the fear was still etched in his face, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. I took the alarm clock from him, feeling its cold plastic in my palm. I stared at the grinning, plastic cow, feeling a chill run down my spine. What had seemed so harmless before, now felt strangely sinister. "How could it make that noise?" I asked, my voice a mere squeak. Dad shrugged, still pale, still shaken. "I don't know. It's just an old alarm clock, that's all. It must have gotten stuck." But even as he spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The laughter, the way it had seemed so alive, so menacing, had been real. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the quiet of the house. The Dairy cow alarm clock sat on my bedside table, its grinning plastic face staring back at me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the laughter. In the morning, Dad was back to his usual self, dismissing the incident as a silly old alarm clock. He even chuckled about it over breakfast. Mom, however, still looked pale and shaken. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started researching Dairy cow alarm clocks. I found them on eBay, old, forgotten relics of a bygone era, but nothing about them was sinister. Nothing could explain the laughter. Days later, while clearing out the attic, I stumbled across another box. Hidden underneath a pile of old clothes, it held more forgotten treasures. A collection of my old toys, a box of photo albums, and tucked away in the corner, a small red book. It was a diary, my diary. I sat down on the floor, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. I opened the diary and began to read, my eyes lingering on a particular entry. Today, I found an old Dairy cow alarm clock in the attic. I hid it in my secret box. I don't want anyone to see it. I stared at the entry, a chill running down my spine. This diary, this entry, it was from when I was a child. But I had no recollection of writing it, of hiding the Dairy cow alarm clock. I looked up, the attic suddenly feeling cold and oppressive. I glanced at the grinning plastic cow on the bedside table. My skin prickled with a strange, unsettling sensation. That night, I lay awake again, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. The silence of the house was broken by a low, almost inaudible hum. It was coming from the direction of the Dairy cow alarm clock. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The hum was getting louder, becoming a throbbing pulse that resonated through the room. Then I heard it. A faint, echoing laugh, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the Dairy cow alarm clock wasn't just a faulty alarm clock. It was something else. Something I couldn't understand, something that was, somehow, tied to me. The next day, I woke up with a headache, a feeling of unease that clung to me like a shroud. I decided to get rid of the alarm clock, to rid myself of this unsettling feeling. I walked down to the attic, intending to throw it away. As I approached the box, I felt a sudden surge of energy, a tingling sensation that ran down my arms. The box vibrated slightly, as if something within it was trying to break free. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Then I took a deep breath and opened the box. Inside, the Dairy cow alarm clock was pulsing, a soft light emanating from its plastic face. It was emitting a low hum, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to resonate with my own heartbeat. As I reached out to take it, the hum intensified, the light growing brighter. The attic was filled with a low, murmuring sound, like 1,000 voices whispering in unison. Suddenly, I felt a strong pull, a powerful force that seemed to emanate from the alarm clock. I gasped, my hand flying away from it. The light intensified, growing blindingly bright. A wave of heat washed over me, the air crackling with energy. I stumbled back, my legs weak, my body trembling. Then it stopped. The light faded, the humming ceased. The attic was silent, the air still. The Dairy cow alarm clock lay motionless in the box, its face dark, its plastic shell cold. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what had just happened, but I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I had narrowly escaped something. Something that was not just an alarm clock, but something infinitely more powerful, something with a life of its own. I closed the box, forcing myself to ignore the unsettling sensation that something was still there, watching, waiting. I left the attic, the box with the Dairy cow alarm clock inside untouched. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I couldn't bring myself to forget the strange, unsettling events that had unfolded. The Dairy cow alarm clock sat on my desk, a constant reminder of the night we heard the laughter. I knew I couldn't ignore it, couldn't forget it. I knew it held a secret, a mystery that was yet to be unraveled. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the laughter was just the beginning. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the familiar halls of Sunnyside Daycare, painting the walls in hues of orange and gold. It was the end of the day, and a sense of quiet anticipation hung in the air. Most of the children had been picked up, leaving a small handful of us stragglers. Miss Amelia, with her kind smile and ever-present patience, gathered us together. "All right, little ones," she announced in her soothing voice. "It's time to head to the front room. Your parents should be arriving soon." We followed her in a single-file line, our tiny feet padding softly on the carpeted floor. The air was thick with the scent of crayons and cinnamon rolls, a familiar comfort that always lingered in the daycare. As we turned the corner into the hallway leading to the front room, I felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. A shiver ran down my spine. The lights seemed to dim, the air becoming cooler and heavier. It wasn't a drastic change, but enough to make me pause, my eyes searching the familiar room. But it was empty. Gone. My heart hammered in my chest, a drumbeat of panic. The other children, the colorful plastic chairs, the worn wooden playhouse, all vanished. Only the dim afternoon light filtering through the windows remained, casting long, eerie shadows that danced around me. "Where is everyone?" I whispered, my voice trembling. My gaze darted around, seeking a familiar face, an outstretched hand. But the room was eerily silent, a tomb of absence. A wave of fear washed over me. I was alone. Or so it felt. I ran, my small legs carrying me through the empty halls, my eyes frantically scanning every corner. The windows in the hallway grew darker, the light outside fading into twilight. The once comforting scent of crayons and cinnamon rolls was replaced by a sharp, unfamiliar coldness. I burst into the art room, the remnants of a finger-painted masterpiece still drying on the easel. My small fingers traced the lines of the rainbow, the bright colors a stark contrast to the unsettling void in my heart. Despair threatened to consume me, but a flicker of defiance ignited within me. I wouldn't give in to fear. I would find them. I raced through the daycare, my tiny legs pumping, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I pushed open doors, peered into empty rooms, called out in a voice that cracked with fear. Finally, in the hallway leading to the back entrance, I saw her. Miss Amelia. She stood by the door, her face etched with concern. As I ran towards her, I saw a flicker of relief in her eyes. "There you are!" she exclaimed, pulling me into a tight embrace. "We've been looking for you everywhere. Where is everyone?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She gently led me to the front room, where the other children were sitting patiently on the floor, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the setting sun. "They were all here, sweetie," she said softly, taking my hand. "You must have gotten lost. You were playing with the blocks in the back room, and you must have wandered off." I looked around the room, my eyes searching for a clue, a reason for this strange absence. Miss Amelia noticed my confusion. "It's okay," she said with a patient smile. "Sometimes we get a little lost in our own world. You just had a little adventure, that's all." She sat me down on the floor beside the other children, and we waited for our parents to arrive. The other kids seemed oblivious to my strange experience, chattering excitedly about their day. I didn't understand what had happened. Where had everyone gone? Why had the light faded? Why hadn't anyone noticed I was missing? As my mother arrived and scooped me up in her arms, I tried to tell her about the strange emptiness, the feeling of being alone, the sudden shift in the light. But the words caught in my throat. I couldn't explain it. The fear, the confusion, the lingering sense of something not quite right. "Mommy," I whispered, clinging to her, "I thought I was lost." She smiled reassuringly, gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. "It's okay, sweetie," she said. "You're safe now. We're home." But even as I snuggled into her warmth, the echo of that empty hallway lingered in my mind. I didn't know what to make of it, but the feeling of being lost, of being alone, stayed with me, a haunting reminder of that strange afternoon at Sunnyside Daycare. The following days were filled with laughter and play. The strange event at the daycare seemed to fade into the background of my mind, replaced by the daily routines of childhood. Yet, every now and then, a flicker of that unsettling feeling would return. The empty halls, the fading light, the sense of being lost. Time passed, and the memory of that day faded further. I grew older, moved on, and the incident became a hazy echo in the recesses of my mind. But then, years later, I stumbled upon a photograph. It was from a school trip, a picture of me and my classmates standing in a line, our faces beaming with youthful exuberance. And there, in the background, I saw it. A doorway, leading to a hallway, bathed in an unnervingly dim light. It was the hallway from the daycare, the one where I had felt so lost and alone. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. It brought back all those forgotten feelings, the fear, the confusion, the sense of something not quite right. For years, I tried to explain away the experience as a child's imagination, a fleeting moment of fear magnified by a sensitive heart. But now, faced with that image, I realized how deeply rooted it had been, how that strange afternoon at Sunnyside Daycare had etched itself into the fabric of my memory, a puzzle piece that fit perfectly into the larger picture of my life. What had happened that day? Why had the light faded? Why had I felt so lost? The answer, I knew, lay somewhere in the shadows of the forgotten hallway, in the whispers of a memory that refused to be silenced. And though I may never fully understand the mystery of that day, the experience served as a constant reminder of the fragility of reality, the haunting beauty of the unknown, and the enduring power of the human spirit to face the unknown, to navigate the shadows, and to find our way back to the light. Years passed, and the memory of Sunnyside Daycare fell further into the background of my life. I built a family, pursued my dreams, and embraced the joys and challenges of adulthood. But every now and then, the echo of that empty hallway would resurface. The feeling of being lost, the fading light, the unsettling sense of a reality slightly out of kilter. I would often find myself drawn to old photographs, to the fading ink of forgotten memories. In those snapshots of a bygone era, I would search for clues, for a glimpse of something unusual, something that whispered of the uncanny. One day, while sorting through a box of old belongings, I came across a dusty scrapbook filled with childhood memories. Among the faded photos and scribbled notes, I found a newspaper clipping from the local paper. The headline read, "Sunnyside Daycare Closure, Building Sold to Developers." The article detailed the history of the daycare, its closure due to declining enrollment, and the upcoming demolition of the building to make way for a new development. I reread the article several times, my heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. It was a mundane news item, but there was something about it that stirred a deep sense of unease within me. The thought of the daycare, the place where I had experienced that strange and unsettling afternoon, being completely erased from existence felt like a violation. It was as if a part of my own past, a memory that I had struggled to understand, was being wiped away, leaving only a void in its stead. A few days later, I drove past the site of the former daycare. The building was gone, replaced by a sprawling office complex. A sense of melancholy settled over me. I felt a deep longing to be back in that building, to walk through those familiar halls once more, to confront the mystery of that fading afternoon. But the building was gone, its secrets buried beneath the concrete and steel of the new development. As I drove away, I realized that the mystery of Sunnyside Daycare wasn't about finding answers, but rather about embracing the unknown, about recognizing the power of memory, and about accepting that some things in life are meant to remain shrouded in enigma. The feeling of being lost, of being alone, had never truly left me. It had become a part of me, a reminder of the fragility of reality, and the enduring power of the human spirit to navigate the shadows, to find our way back to the light, and to make sense of the world, even when it seems to be unraveling around us. The memory is a hazy thing, a flickering shadow in the corner of my mind. A few years ago, I desperately needed to reach my parents. I can't recall the reason now, but it must have been urgent, something that needed immediate attention. The usual routine of texting them first had failed. Neither of their cell phones answered. Panic began to creep in. It wasn't like them to ignore my messages. I tried calling them, but their phones went straight to voicemail. Desperation gnawed at me. What if something had happened? The what-ifs flooded my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. I pictured them lying injured, unable to call for help. The image was so vivid, so real, that I could almost feel the cold dread in my bones. I dialed their home phone. It rang twice before connecting, and a faint, garbled sound emerged from the receiver. It was like a muffled conversation, voices far away, distorted as if passing through a thick fog. I strained to understand, but the words remained elusive, a jumble of unrecognizable sounds. The connection was brief, lasting only about 10 seconds before abruptly ending. I was left staring at the disconnected phone, my mind racing. The brief, distorted conversation, the strange sounds, the sudden disconnect, it all felt deeply unsettling. The clock on my desk ticked steadily, a constant reminder of the passing time. 9 p.m. I started pacing, the unease gnawing at me. What had happened? Was it a prank? A malfunction? Or something else entirely? My parents called me back around 10:30 p.m., their voices bubbling with excitement. They had been out at a movie, which had started at 8:30 p.m. My mother had even snagged a limited edition popcorn bucket. They sounded completely oblivious to my anxiety. "We were at the cinema, honey," my mother said, her voice filled with amusement. "We didn't even hear the phone." I told them about the call. The strange, distorted voices. The abrupt disconnect. My mother laughed it off, attributing it to a bad connection. My father, always the pragmatist, suggested a faulty line. But the incident left an unsettling mark on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Who had been talking in my parents' house? Why had the call ended so abruptly? My parents, understandably, dismissed my concerns. They had been out, they were alone, and there was no explanation for what happened. The incident faded into the background, becoming just another strange anecdote in the vast tapestry of life. But years later, the memory lingered, a faint echo of a mystery that remained unsolved. There were nights when I would lie awake, replaying the events of that evening, trying to unravel the bizarre conversation, the distorted voices, the sudden disconnect. I would imagine different scenarios, different explanations, but none of them felt quite right. The incident became a private puzzle, a secret I kept hidden, a question mark that refused to be erased. It was a tiny, insignificant event, but it held an undeniable power over me, a constant reminder of the unknown, the unexplainable, the things hidden just beyond our perception. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the incident faded from my active memory. It became a whisper in the back of my mind, a forgotten dream. I continued my life, moving forward with the familiar rhythms of my routines. But the weight of that unanswered question lingered. It was a nagging itch, a persistent whisper at the edge of my consciousness. It was a reminder that even in the mundanity of everyday life, there were strange, inexplicable events that defied easy explanation. One day, I was going through some old photo albums, reminiscing about the past. My parents were in one of the photos, standing in front of their house, their smiles bright and carefree. They looked so alive, so full of life. I couldn't help but think about that night, the strange call, the unanswered questions. I decided to call them, just to chat. After all, it had been a while since we had spoken. "How are you, Mom?" I asked, the memory of the incident flickering in my mind. "We're doing great, honey," she replied, her voice a comforting hum. "We just had a lovely lunch with friends." We chatted for a while, catching up on each other's lives. I felt a sense of normalcy wash over me, a wave of comfort that had been missing for a long time. As I was about to hang up, a pang of curiosity struck me. "Mom, remember that weird call I got a few years ago?" There was a pause on the other side of the line. "What call, honey?" "You know, that night when you were at the movies." It was a strange, distorted conversation, and then it just disconnected. I braced myself for a casual dismissal, a laugh, an explanation. But my mother's voice sounded hesitant. "I remember you mentioning it, but I can't say I recall the details." Maybe it was a mistake? I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't just the lack of memory, but the tone of her voice, the hesitation, the uncertainty. It was as if she were trying to convince herself as much as me. "But you were alone, right? No one could have been talking on the phone." "Well, I suppose so. But you know how clumsy I can be sometimes. Maybe I accidentally picked up the phone without realizing it, and then it disconnected?" Her explanation felt flimsy, a desperate attempt to explain away the inexplicable. It was as if she were consciously suppressing a memory, a truth that she couldn't face. "It's okay, Mom," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Just a strange incident. It doesn't really matter." But deep down, I knew it did matter. It mattered because it was a glimpse into the unknown, a reminder that there were things in the world that we couldn't understand, couldn't explain, couldn't control. The conversation ended, but the incident remained, a faint ghost in my memory, a whisper in the quiet corners of my mind. It was a reminder that even in the familiar comfort of family, there were secrets, there were mysteries, there were things that we couldn't fully comprehend. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, staring at the empty room. The feeling of unease returned, a familiar prickling beneath my skin. It was a feeling I had grown accustomed to, a constant companion in the shadows of my mind. The next day, I decided to visit my parents. They lived in a quiet suburb, a cozy little house surrounded by a lush garden. I had been meaning to visit for a while, but something had always held me back, a subtle resistance that I couldn't fully explain. I rang the doorbell, and my mother opened the door, her face lighting up at the sight of me. She ushered me in, her warmth as familiar and comforting as a worn-out blanket. We sat in the living room, sipping coffee and chatting. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked cookies, a familiar aroma that always evoked a sense of peace and contentment. "I was thinking about that call," I began, a hint of apprehension in my voice. "The one you couldn't remember?" My mother's smile faltered. She looked away, her eyes flickering towards the window. I told you, honey. It was probably nothing. Maybe I just picked up the phone by accident. But you were alone. I tried to keep my voice neutral, but the accusation was impossible to hide. My mother took a deep breath, her hand trembling slightly. Listen, sweetheart, it's not like we have anything to hide. There's nothing to explain. Her words were laced with defensiveness, a desperate attempt to convince me, to convince herself. I knew that she wasn't telling me everything. The tension in the air was palpable, heavy, and suffocating. I just want to understand, I said, my voice soft but firm. It's not about blaming anyone. It's about knowing what happened. My mother sighed, a deep, weary sigh that held years of unspoken secrets. It's a long story, honey. It's something we've been trying to forget, to move on from. I stared at her, a sense of unease rising within me. I had known my parents my entire life, but it was as if I were seeing them for the first time. The familiar facade had crumbled, revealing a hidden depth, a darkness that I had never known existed. Please, I said, my voice catching. Tell me. My mother hesitated, her gaze shifting around the room. She seemed to be weighing her words, carefully considering the consequences of her revelation. After a moment she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. It started a few years ago, before you called. We had been hearing strange noises in the house, late at night. Like whispers, footsteps, something moving around. It was always quiet, subtle, but it was enough to make our skin crawl. I leaned forward, my senses heightened. It was as if a cold wind had blown through the room, sending a shiver down my spine. I had never heard my parents speak about this before. They had always seemed so grounded, so practical, so unfazed by anything. But the fear in their eyes, the tremor in their voices, made it clear that they were deeply affected. We tried to ignore it, my mother continued, her voice trembling. We thought it was just our imaginations, the house settling, something like that. But it kept happening, night after night, until we felt like we were losing our minds. Did you call the police? I asked, the question escaping my lips before I could stop it. My mother shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and shame. We didn't want to admit that we were afraid. We didn't want to make a scene. We thought it would just go away. But it didn't go away. The strange noises continued, growing more frequent, more insistent. My parents became increasingly agitated, restless, unable to sleep. They started avoiding the house at night, staying at friends' places, trying to escape the unsettling presence that haunted their home. Then, one night, it escalated, my mother said, her voice barely a murmur. We were both asleep when we were woken up by a loud crash. We ran downstairs to find the living room in shambles. Furniture overturned, lamps shattered, pictures ripped from the wall. It was like a whirlwind had come through, she added, her voice shaking. It was terrifying. They called the police, but the officers found nothing. They chalked it up to a break-in, even though nothing had been stolen. The incident left my parents shaken, their sense of security shattered. We didn't know what to do, my mother whispered, her eyes filled with a haunting sadness. We felt like we were losing control. We felt like we were going crazy. They decided to move. They sold their house and bought a new one, hoping to escape the haunting presence that had plagued them. But the strange occurrences continued, following them like a shadow. We started hearing the whispers again, the footsteps. We felt like we were caught in a nightmare, my mother said, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. Did you ever find out what was causing it? I asked, my voice filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. No, my mother replied, her voice shaking. We never found out. It just stopped, as suddenly as it started. I sat there, absorbing their story, trying to make sense of it all. It seemed so improbable, so unreal. But deep down, I knew that my parents were telling the truth. I could see the fear in their eyes, the trauma etched into their faces. The incident had changed them, leaving a lasting scar on their souls. It had robbed them of their sense of security, their peace of mind. As I sat with my parents, listening to their story, I realized that I had stumbled upon a secret, a darkness that had been hidden beneath the surface of their lives. It was a secret that had haunted them for years, a secret that they had tried to forget, to bury deep within themselves. I didn't have any answers for them, no explanation for the strange occurrences that had plagued their lives. But I knew that I couldn't let them carry this burden alone. I had to be there for them, to offer them my support, my love, my understanding. I stayed with them for the rest of the evening, listening to their stories, sharing my own. We laughed, we cried, we shared a meal, a moment of connection that felt more profound than ever before. As I drove home, the weight of their secret, the burden of their trauma, stayed with me. But it was no longer a source of fear, but a reminder of the fragility of life, the power of the unknown, and the strength of human bonds. The strange call, the distorted voices, the abrupt disconnect, all these things had led me to a deeper understanding of my parents, their lives, their fears. It had been a journey into the shadows, a glimpse into the hidden world of the unexplained. And while it had left me with more questions than answers, it had also strengthened my connection to my parents, forging a bond that felt unbreakable. The memory of that night, the memory of the strange call, would remain with me, a persistent reminder of the mysteries that lie hidden beneath the surface of reality, the secrets that lurk in the shadows, the things that we can't explain, but which shape our lives in ways that we can't fully comprehend. A few years back, I lived with my mother and our loyal German shepherd, Luna, in a cozy 2-bedroom rented townhome. Luna was an integral part of our small family, fiercely protective and ever-present, especially during the quiet hours of the night when she would curl up on my bed, her warm body a comforting presence against the darkness. One ordinary evening, I returned home from work, greeted by the familiar routine of our daily lives. As the aroma of dinner wafted from the kitchen, I knocked on my mother's door, inviting her to join me at the table. A faint whiff of cigarette smoke mingled with the scent of food, and I heard a muffled grunt in response. Assuming my mother was simply enjoying a quick cigarette before dinner, I proceeded downstairs to eat alone, leaving a plate aside for her. As the clock ticked past midnight, I drifted into a deep slumber. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by a gentle touch, someone holding and shaking my hand. My eyes snapped open, and I scanned my surroundings with a surge of alarm. Luna, my ever-vigilant companion, was nowhere to be found. The bed was empty, and there was no sign of her in the room. She had been there when I went to sleep, her soft snores lulling me into slumber. Confusion and unease washed over me. I had always kept my bedroom door shut and locked at night, a habit instilled in me from childhood. Now I realized with a growing sense of dread, the door was ajar, and frantic scratching sounds echoed from the hallway. Luna was outside, desperately trying to get in. I bolted out of bed and flung the door open, Luna rushing inside, her tail wagging furiously. She immediately began a frantic search of the room, her keen nose sniffing every corner. I followed close behind, calling out for my mother, but there was no response. The silence was eerie, broken only by the sound of Luna's paws on the wooden floor. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized the unsettling truth: my mother was gone. The bed was neatly made, her television was turned off, and her belongings were undisturbed. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Luna and I searched the entire house, our hearts pounding with a mix of fear and desperation. Every room, every closet, every nook and cranny yielded nothing. The doors and windows were all locked, with no signs of forced entry. It was as if my mother had simply disappeared without a trace. Overwhelmed by a sense of impending doom, I dialed my mother's number, praying for a reassuring voice on the other end. To my horror, her phone rang unanswered. Panic surged through me as I frantically called her again and again, each unanswered ring deepening my despair. As the night wore on, I sat in stunned silence, trying to make sense of the impossible. My mother had vanished without a word, leaving behind an empty house and 1,000 unanswered questions. Fear gnawed at me, whispering insidious doubts and terrifying scenarios. In the bleak light of dawn, I called my mother's workplace, only to be met with more bewilderment. They confirmed that she had not come to work the previous day and had not called in sick. A cold wave of realization washed over me. Something was terribly wrong. With trembling hands, I dialed the police, my voice thick with emotion. As I recounted the events of the night, a sense of dread hung heavy in the air. The police listened intently, their faces etched with concern. They promised to investigate, but warned me that without any evidence of foul play, there was little they could do. As the days turned into sleepless nights, I clung to the hope that my mother would return, that this was all just a cruel misunderstanding. But as time went on, that hope began to dwindle, replaced by a gnawing sense of loss and uncertainty. In the end, my mother was never found. The police investigation hit dead end after dead end, and her disappearance remained a haunting mystery. Luna and I were left alone in the empty townhome, our lives forever changed by the unexplained absence that had torn our family apart. The years that followed were a blur of grief, unanswered questions, and a constant yearning for the woman who had vanished without a trace. I often found myself retracing the steps of that fateful night, searching for clues, for any sign that could lead me to the truth. But every attempt ended in disappointment, leaving me with only a deeper sense of loss and the haunting realization that the mystery of my mother's disappearance would likely remain unsolved forever. The first time I met Liam, he was covered in mud. It was a hot August afternoon, the kind that makes the air shimmer, and we were both down by the river, trying to cool off. He was skinny then, with a mop of unruly brown hair that fell into his eyes and a freckle-dusted nose that crinkled when he laughed. I was a year older, more self-conscious, with a carefully cultivated image of indifference. Yet something about Liam's infectious energy, his wide-eyed wonder at the world, drew me in. "Hey," he said, his voice a little hoarse from the heat. "I'm Liam." "Sarah," I mumbled, trying to sound nonchalant. He grinned, a gap-toothed grin that could light up a room. "Cool. Want to go for a swim?" We spent the afternoon splashing around in the murky water, making up stories about the moss-covered rocks and the branches that snagged in the current. It was the beginning of a friendship that would shape our years, a bond forged in shared laughter and secrets whispered under the stars. As the years passed, our lives started to diverge. He went off to college studying history, his passion for the past burning bright. I stayed closer to home, taking a job at the local library, surrounded by the smell of old paper and quiet contemplation. We still kept in touch, late-night phone calls filled with rambling stories and dreams for the future. One winter, I got a call that sent a chill down my spine. Liam, his voice tight with fear, told me about the accident. His car had skidded on a patch of black ice, flipping over on a remote country road. He was lucky to be alive, but the impact had left him with a shattered leg and a broken spirit. That night, I drove to the hospital, the snow blurring the familiar landscape into a swirling white void. Liam was pale and gaunt, a cast covering his leg, his eyes haunted by the near-death experience. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "I should have been more careful." "It's okay," I said, squeezing his hand. "You're lucky to be alive." But the accident had left its mark. It shattered his carefree spirit, replaced it with a cautiousness that bled into every aspect of his life. The reckless joy that had once defined him was replaced by a quiet melancholy. 3 years later, we were both back in our hometown, settling into the familiar rhythms of small-town life. Liam had graduated, his studies focused on local history, specifically the obscure lore and legends that whispered through the valleys and hills of our rural community. I was still at the library, surrounded by the dusty tales of the past, finding solace in the quiet whispers of forgotten stories. One Friday night, I was closing up the library when my phone buzzed. It was Liam. "Hey," he said, his voice strained. "I need to talk to you. Can you meet me at the back of the cemetery?" I hesitated. The cemetery was an eerie place, a graveyard of forgotten dreams and whispered secrets. It was a place I tried to avoid, especially after dark. But Liam rarely sounded this desperate, so I agreed. I found Liam sitting on the edge of a crumbling stone mausoleum, his face pale in the moonlight. He was looking at a small, engraved headstone, his eyes filled with a strange mix of sadness and fear. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice hesitant. "It's about the cemetery," Liam said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been doing some research on the local legends, and I think there's something truly strange going on here." He led me to a section of the cemetery, shrouded in a dense thicket of overgrown pines. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the silence itself was holding its breath. "There are rumors about a group, a clan," Liam said, his voice trembling. "Legends say they gather here under the veil of darkness, performing their rituals." He pointed to a cluster of fresh dirt, the grave markers still new. "It's been happening more and more lately. There are whispers, stories of strange lights and sounds, of figures seen in the shadows. People are starting to get scared." I looked at the new grave, the air thick with unease. "What kind of rituals?" I asked, a shiver running down my spine. "I don't know," he said, his voice growing fainter. "But I think they're powerful, ancient rituals, dark magic." He told me about his recent discovery, an old, handwritten journal he had found in the attic of the local historical society. It contained a detailed account of a group of men, cloaked in white, who gathered in the cemetery under the cover of darkness. The journal described their rituals, their chants, their sacrifices. It spoke of a power that resided within them, a power that could twist the fabric of reality itself. I looked at Liam, his eyes wide with fear and fascination. He had always been drawn to the mysteries of the past, but there was something about this particular discovery that unsettled him. We left the cemetery, the shadows lengthening behind us, the air still thick with the scent of decay and fear. As we drove back, Liam told me about a strange encounter he'd had a few weeks earlier. "I was driving home late one night," he said, his voice tight. "I was taking the gravel shortcut past the cemetery. I noticed several trucks and lights at the cemetery, so I started to pull over to see what was going on." He continued, his voice barely audible. "There were a bunch of motherfuckers in white hoodies in a circle. Some sort of clan ritual, we think, but we don't really know what they were doing. I noped out of there really fast, but some of them saw me and followed me in my car all the way back to town." He stopped, his face pale in the moonlight. "I haven't seen them since, but I know they're out there. They're watching." I tried to reassure him, to dismiss his fear as a product of an overactive imagination. But a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. It was one thing to read about such things in books, but it was a whole different story to find yourself entangled in the reality of it. Over the next few weeks, Liam's demeanor became increasingly erratic. He became obsessed with the journal, spending hours poring over its pages, deciphering its cryptic symbols and rituals. He started to see patterns in the seemingly random events, connections that defied logic. He became convinced that the group was real, that they were slowly tightening their grip on our community. His fear, his obsession, began to seep into my own life. The shadows seemed to lengthen, the nights grew darker. I started to see faces in the darkness, hear whispers in the wind. My once comforting world had become a place of unsettling, unseen forces. One evening, I was sitting at the library, sorting through a stack of overdue books, when Liam called. His voice was strained, almost hysterical. "Sarah," he whispered, "I think they're going to do something tonight." He told me he had found a coded message hidden in the journal, a dire warning about a ceremony scheduled to take place at the cemetery that night. He believed the group was planning to unleash a force of darkness, a power that could shatter the fabric of reality itself. I knew I had to do something. Liam was in a fragile state, his fear consuming him, and I couldn't let him face this alone. I drove to Liam's apartment, the darkness of the night pressing in around me. He was waiting on the porch, his face pale and drawn. "I'm coming with you," I said, my voice firm. "We have to stop them." Liam hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "I don't know if we can," he said, his voice barely audible. "They're powerful. They've been here for centuries." We drove to the cemetery, the headlights illuminating the rows of headstones like rows of teeth in the darkness. The air was thick with fog, the silence broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. As we approached the cemetery, we saw a ring of flickering lights, a circle of figures silhouetted against the pale moonlight. I gripped Liam's hand, my heart pounding in my chest. We crept closer, careful to stay hidden in the shadows, my fear gnawing at my insides. I saw the figures, cloaked in white, their faces hidden by the shadows of their hoods. They stood in a circle, their hands reaching towards the sky, their chanting rising in a low, guttural rhythm that sent chills down my spine. Liam reached for a small camera, his hands trembling. The lens was pointed at the circle of figures, the flash frozen, capturing a moment of unsettling beauty, of ancient power unleashed. Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to stir. A low, guttural growl echoed through the cemetery, and a figure emerged from the center of the circle. It was tall and gaunt, with eyes that burned like embers in the darkness. It moved with a grace that defied its skeletal frame, its every step a whisper of ancient power. I felt a surge of terror, a primal fear that froze me in place. Liam's hand tightened around mine, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and dread. The figure raised its arms, and a wave of energy pulsed through the cemetery, shaking the ground beneath our feet. The figures in the circle chanted louder, their voices merging into a single, guttural roar that echoed through the surrounding hills. We watched in horror as the figure began to chant, its voice deep and resonant, filled with a power that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of reality. The air crackled with energy, the fog swirling around us like a living entity. Liam was frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. He was trying to capture it all on film, to document the unspeakable, the unseen. I knew we had to leave, had to escape this place, this ritual, this power. But I was frozen, my body paralyzed by fear. I could only watch, helpless, as the figure unleashed its power, its voice rising to a crescendo of unholy energy. That was when the ground cracked open. A deep, gaping chasm appeared in the center of the circle, a gateway to the unknown. The figure raised its arms, and a beam of pure white light shot out from its hands, piercing the darkness. Liam stumbled back, his camera falling from his grasp, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and despair. "They've opened the door." He reached for me, his hand trembling. "We have to get out of here." We turned and ran, our hearts pounding in our chests, the chilling, guttural chant of the figures echoing behind us. We ran through the graveyard, the darkness closing in around us. I tripped and fell, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them coming, their footsteps heavy on the ground, the sound of their chanting growing louder. They were close. Liam helped me to my feet, his face pale with fear. We ran, blindly, desperately, through the graveyard, the darkness swallowing us whole. We finally reached the edge of the cemetery, the road beyond a beacon of hope. We stumbled onto the asphalt, our lungs burning, our bodies trembling. We didn't stop running until we were miles away, the cemetery a distant memory. That night, we never spoke of what we had seen, what we had witnessed. It was a secret we shared, a nightmare that bound us tighter. The following day, the news spread through our small town like wildfire. The cemetery, once a place of quiet contemplation, became a source of hushed whispers and fearful speculation. People spoke of strange lights seen in the sky, of unsettling sounds echoing through the night. Liam, his fear turning to a dark fascination, began to research the journal, trying to understand the power that had been unleashed, the consequences of the ritual. He was haunted by the memory of the figure, its eyes burning with an ancient power, its voice a chilling whisper of ancient magic. I, too, was changed by what we had witnessed. I no longer saw the world as a place of innocent wonder. I saw shadows everywhere, heard whispers on the wind. The darkness, once an abstract concept, had become a tangible force, a presence that lurked just beyond the threshold of my perception. We tried to move on, to find solace in the familiar routines of our lives. But the memories of that night remained, a constant reminder of the dark side of our shared history, of the ancient powers that dwelled in the shadows of our world. One night, a few weeks later, I went for a walk, trying to clear my head, to escape the oppressive weight of the past. As I walked past the cemetery, the moonlight filtering through the trees, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, shrouded in shadow. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to see it, didn't want to believe it, but there it was, the figure I had seen that night, its eyes burning with an unholy light. I turned and ran, the figure's laughter echoing behind me, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. As I ran, I knew I would never be the same. The world I knew had changed. The past, once a collection of stories and legends, had become a tangible force, a presence that haunted my dreams and weighed heavy on my heart. The darkness was real, and it was growing stronger. The story of the cemetery, the rituals, the figure, became a secret we shared, a bond forged in fear and the shared knowledge of the unseen. It was a story that haunted us, a reminder that in the shadows of our world, there were forces at play, ancient and powerful, that we could never fully comprehend. The world remains a place of shadows and whispers, of secrets buried deep in the earth. The past is never truly past, and the darkness, once a whisper, now echoes in the silence, a constant reminder that we are never truly alone. And somewhere, in the darkness of the old cemetery, a figure stands watch, its eyes burning with an unholy light, its voice a chilling whisper of ancient magic, waiting for the moment to return. The faded for sale sign, a stark white rectangle against the backdrop of the weathered farmhouse, had a visceral impact on me. It was like staring into a forgotten corner of my own mind, a memory so vivid it felt like a photograph, yet impossible to reconcile with the collective amnesia of my family. It was the summer after my freshman year of college, and I was back in my hometown, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the lazy drone of cicadas. I was scrolling through online real estate listings, a mindless distraction from the daunting task of finding a summer job. Then it hit me. A farmhouse, nestled between rolling hills, its white clapboard siding sun-bleached and its porch creaking with age, the same farmhouse I distinctly remembered spending a night in with my mom. The memory was so clear it had the power to make my breath catch. The scent of cinnamon from freshly baked cookies wafting from the kitchen, the warm glow of lamplight filtering through the lace curtains, the creaky floorboards echoing with every step, the peculiar, comforting smell of old books and dust, it all came flooding back. Except, there was a problem. Nobody else remembered it. Mom, remember that farmhouse we used to drive past on the way to Grandma's? I asked cautiously, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and unease. The one with the big porch and the white picket fence? My mom's eyes widened. What farmhouse? I don't remember any farmhouse like that on the way to your grandma's. But you used to take me there. We even spent a night there, remember? We slept in the guest room, and the lady had cookies. Honey, I never took you to any farmhouse with a lady who baked cookies, she said, her voice firm but laced with a hint of confusion. And we definitely never spent the night anywhere but at your grandma's. My aunt, who had been listening from the next room, chimed in, her tone dismissive. That's impossible. You're probably just mixing things up. We never stayed anywhere but at Grandma's. My uncle, who had always been the family jokester, even added, maybe you dreamt it, kiddo. Those summer nights can get pretty wild. Their collective denial left me bewildered. How could I be so wrong? How could a memory so vivid, so full of sensory detail, simply disappear? It was as if my mind was playing tricks on me, weaving a fantastical story from thin air. But I knew I wasn't wrong. The farmhouse in the online listing, with its picture-perfect facade and seemingly untouched interior, was an exact replica of the house in my memory. The only difference was the price tag, a figure far beyond what my family could have afforded in the early 90s. And then came the bombshell. The listing confirmed that the house had never changed hands. It had been owned by the same family since it was built, over a century ago. This was impossible. I was born in 1983. I was a child in the 90s. If the house had never been up for sale, how could I have been there? How could I have spent the night in the guest room, nestled under a floral quilt, with the smell of freshly baked cookies filling the air? There was only one explanation that made any sense. My mom was a drug addict. The realization was like a punch to the gut. I had always known about her struggles, the whispers and the hushed conversations, the sudden disappearances and the strained silences. But I had always clung to the naive belief that it hadn't affected me, that it hadn't seeped into the fabric of my childhood. Now, the memory of the farmhouse, the undeniable clarity of its details, was painting a different picture, a picture where my mother's addiction had infiltrated every aspect of my life, including moments I thought were safe and untainted. The farmhouse had become the physical embodiment of my mother's secret life, a silent testament to a history she had tried so hard to bury. "Mom, did you know the people who lived in that farmhouse?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "I told you. I don't remember any farmhouse," she said, her voice tight with an undercurrent of defensiveness. "And I definitely didn't know anyone who lived there." But I knew she was lying. The way she averted her eyes, the way her voice faltered, the way her fingers unconsciously traced the pattern on her skirt, it all screamed of guilt and denial. My family's silence, their unwavering insistence that the farmhouse was a figment of my imagination, only cemented my suspicion. They knew, or they suspected, but they were choosing to remain silent, to protect my mother from the consequences of her actions. It was then I realized that I was not just confronting the ghosts of my mother's past, but also the ghosts of my own childhood. I was confronting the painful truth that my childhood wasn't as idyllic as I had always believed, that my memories, the very foundation of my identity, were built on a foundation of lies and deceit. The farmhouse was more than a memory, it was a symbol. It represented the fractured reality of my childhood, the hidden truths I was only beginning to grasp. I spent the rest of my summer grappling with the revelation, my mind haunted by the images of the farmhouse, the scent of cinnamon cookies, the creaky floorboards, the comforting warmth of lamplight. The more I tried to piece together the puzzle, the more I realized how much I didn't know. What was the nature of my mother's relationship with the occupants of the farmhouse? Was it a fleeting encounter, or something more? Was it a place where she sought refuge, or a place where she succumbed to her addiction? Why did she never tell me about it? Was it a need to protect me, or a fear of being exposed? These were questions that haunted me, questions that I knew I might never get answers to. I was left with a gnawing suspicion, a feeling that there were more secrets hidden beneath the surface of my family's history, secrets that were more dangerous than any drug my mother could have ever used. As the summer drew to a close, I found myself standing in front of the farmhouse, its white clapboard siding now even more sun-bleached, its porch even more creaky with age. It looked like a relic from a time long past, a silent witness to a story that had unfolded within its walls. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the lazy drone of cicadas. It was the same air I had breathed as a child, the same air that had carried the ghosts of my mother's addiction. The farmhouse was a portal, a doorway to a past I had never truly known, a past that had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. It was a reminder that truth, even the most uncomfortable kind, can be found in the most unexpected places. As I walked away from the farmhouse, the fading for sale sign a stark reminder of the ongoing saga of my family's history, I realized that my journey of discovery was far from over. The farmhouse was just the tip of the iceberg, a glimpse into a world I thought I had left behind but which was always lurking beneath the surface. I knew there were more secrets to uncover, more truths to confront. And I was determined to face them, to grapple with the ghosts of my past, to find the strength to move forward, armed with the knowledge that even in the darkest corners of our lives, there can be light. It was an ordinary evening, the setting sun casting an ethereal glow on the mundane world around me. My mother, a beacon of love and reassurance, was the epicenter of our family's modest abode. As I ambled into the kitchen, the aroma of freshly baked cookies tantalizing my senses, I witnessed a sight that sent shivers down my spine. My mother stood there, her silhouette cast against the soft glow of the stove, her belly visibly swollen with the promise of new life. Yet in her arms she cradled my infant sister, her tiny fingers curled around her mother's thumb. A surge of confusion washed over me, a cognitive dissonance that threatened to shatter the familiar contours of my reality. How could my mother be both pregnant and holding my newborn sister? It defied all logic, all scientific understanding. My mind raced, desperately seeking an explanation, but none presented itself. Panic gnawed at the edges of my consciousness, threatening to consume me. Time seemed to warp around me as I stared at the surreal scene unfolding before my very eyes. My mind oscillated between disbelief and a creeping sense of dread. Slowly, like a marionette whose strings had been severed, I retreated to the safety of the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. In that moment, the walls of my childhood crumbled, and the familiar world I had always known dissolved into a realm of the inexplicable. The boundaries between reality and the fantastical blurred, leaving me questioning the very fabric of existence. I sat in the dimly lit living room, my thoughts swirling like a tempest within the confines of my skull. The sound of my mother's gentle humming from the kitchen reached me, a haunting melody that both soothed and terrified me. I knew I could not confront her, not yet. The sheer magnitude of what I had witnessed threatened to overwhelm me, to shatter the fragile foundation of my sanity. As the night wore on, I drifted in and out of a fitful sleep, haunted by fragmented visions of my mother's dual existence. In my dreams, she was both pregnant and holding my baby sister, her face a mask of serene indifference. I awoke in a cold sweat, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The following days were a torment of uncertainty and fear. I avoided my mother, unable to reconcile the image of her pregnant belly with the memory of her cradling my infant sister. I retreated into myself, becoming a shadow of my former self. My family noticed my withdrawal, their concerned inquiries met with evasive answers and half-truths. The weight of my secret pressed down on me, suffocating me. I knew I could not keep it bottled up forever, but the thought of sharing my experience filled me with a dread that paralyzed me. As the days turned into sleepless nights, I began to doubt my own sanity. Had I imagined the entire episode? Was it a figment of my overworked imagination? The line between reality and delusion became increasingly blurred, leaving me lost in a labyrinth of my own making. Desperate for answers, I confided in my closest friend, Emily. She listened to my account with a mixture of disbelief and concern. Unlike me, she was not easily swayed by the supernatural. She offered rational explanations, suggested I might have been mistaken or even hallucinating. Her words provided a glimmer of hope, a lifeline to which I clung. I began to question my own perceptions, wondering if stress and anxiety had played tricks on my mind. Yet, deep down, a nagging doubt lingered, a whisper in the back of my mind that refused to be silenced. Weeks turned into months, and the memory of that fateful evening continued to haunt me. I sought solace in books, immersing myself in tales of the paranormal and the unexplained. I devoured anything that hinted at an explanation for what I had witnessed. In the end, I found no definitive answers. The mystery of that night remains unsolved, a permanent enigma in the tapestry of my life. Over time, the sharp edges of my fear have dulled, replaced by a muted acceptance of the inexplicable. I have learned to coexist with the uncertainty, to embrace the mystery that lingers at the fringes of my consciousness. And though the events of that night continue to defy rational explanation, they have also taught me a profound lesson about the limits of human understanding and the vastness of the universe that surrounds us. As I look back on that bewildering experience, I am filled with a sense of awe and wonder. It has shaped me in ways I could never have imagined, teaching me the importance of embracing the unknown and the indomitable power of the human spirit. And so, the story of my mother holding my baby sister in her arms while still pregnant remains a tale whispered in hushed tones, a testament to the unfathomable mysteries that lie hidden within the depths of our existence. It was 3 a.m., the graveyard shift, and I was fighting a losing battle against sleep. The only sounds were the muted hum of the refrigerators and the occasional rumble of a passing truck on the highway outside. I'd only been working at the truck stop for a few months, fresh out of high school and desperate for a job. Most nights, I was the only soul on the premises, except for the occasional truck driver stopping for a late-night coffee or a quick bite. But tonight, I had to switch shifts with the night guy, who had a family emergency. So here I was, staring at the clock, wishing for the sun to rise. Then, a car pulled into the parking lot, the sound of its arrival shattering the silence. It wasn't just any car, it was a sleek, black sedan, the kind you'd expect to see in a movie, not in the dusty parking lot of a truck stop. It parked towards the back of the lot, away from the main entrance, and the headlights cut through the darkness, momentarily blinding me. I watched through the window as a tall man got out of the driver's seat, his face obscured by the shadows of the car. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hair slicked back, giving him a vaguely menacing air. But it was the woman in the passenger seat who caught my attention. She was wearing a simple dress, her long hair cascaded down her back like a dark waterfall. She sat perfectly still, her face a blank slate, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the windshield. The man walked around the car, his movements jerky and agitated. He looked over his shoulder several times as if he was expecting someone to be watching him. Then, he opened the car door and pulled something out of the back seat. I couldn't see what it was, but the shape of it, the way he cradled it in his arms, made me instinctively look away. He walked towards the diner, his gaze darting around, seemingly searching for something. I felt a prickle of unease. My shift had been quiet, almost eerily so. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But this man, this scene, felt off. I was about to call the sheriff, just in case, but before I could, he was already inside. He entered the diner, his eyes scanning the empty space. He looked at me, his gaze piercing, a flicker of something, maybe fear, maybe desperation, in his eyes. He said nothing, just approached the counter, his movements surprisingly quick and precise. He grabbed a few things, a pack of cigarettes, a bottle of water, a candy bar. He slammed them on the counter, the sound echoing in the silent diner. His hands trembled slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Can I help you, sir?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly despite my efforts to sound calm. He didn't answer. He just continued to look around the diner, searching, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anxiety. The way he looked at me, it wasn't a casual glance, it was like he was seeing right through me, right into my soul. Then, he spoke, his voice a low rasp that resonated through the silence. "It's quiet out here, isn't it? So quiet you can almost hear the angels singing." His words were unsettling, a chilling statement that pierced through the stillness of the night. I was taken aback, my mind struggling to process what he had just said. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a sense of dread that threatened to engulf me. Yes, sir," I mumbled, my voice barely audible. He didn't reply. He simply stared at me for a moment longer, then turned and walked out of the diner. His movements were quick, almost desperate. He got back in his car, slammed the door shut, and drove off, the sound of his car disappearing into the night. But the woman in the passenger seat didn't move. She remained frozen, her eyes still staring straight ahead, devoid of any emotion. She didn't blink, didn't even breathe. A sense of unease settled over me, a feeling of being watched, of being a part of something I didn't understand. I watched her for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by fear and confusion. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, its screen illuminating my trembling hands, and dialed 911. "Hello, 911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker. My voice came out in a shaky whisper. I think I need to report something. There's a woman in a car, she's not moving, she's just staring, and..." I couldn't finish the sentence. I couldn't explain the unsettling feeling, the sense of dread that was slowly suffocating me. All I could do was stammer. "I think something bad has happened, please hurry." The dispatcher asked me for the address and description of the car, her voice calm, reassuring. I gave her all the information I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched the woman as I talked, expecting her to move, to blink, to do anything to show she was alive. But she remained perfectly still, her face a mask of emptiness, her eyes staring into the void. "I'm sending someone out right away," the dispatcher said, her calm voice a welcome contrast to the panic that was tightening its grip on my heart. A few minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the night, cutting through the silence like a knife. The sheriff's car pulled into the parking lot, its headlights shining on the woman's car. The officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and tired eyes, got out of his car and approached the woman's car. He spoke to her, his voice calm and gentle, but she didn't even flinch. He opened the car door, his face creasing with concern. His hands hovered over her, then hesitated. He called for backup. I watched from my spot behind the counter, my heart thundering in my chest. I couldn't look away, couldn't tear my eyes from the scene unfolding before me. Minutes turned into hours, and still, the woman remained still. The sheriff's deputies and paramedics arrived, their faces etched with worry. They examined the woman, their expressions somber. Finally, one of the paramedics turned to the sheriff, his voice barely a whisper. She's gone. Gone." The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. The sheriff looked at me, his gaze searching. "You said you saw a man leave. What was he like? What did he say?" I told him everything I could remember, the details of the man, his words, his eerie demeanor. The sheriff listened intently, his face growing more serious as I spoke. "Did he seem to be in distress?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "He was anxious, almost scared," I said, my voice barely a whisper. But I couldn't help but feel something else about the man, something more sinister. The sheriff nodded, his eyes narrowed. "We'll need to find him, and we'll need to find out what happened." The next few hours were a blur. The police swarmed the diner, questioning me, taking statements, scrutinizing every detail of the night. They searched the woman's car, but found nothing of value. No weapons, no drugs, no clues. The woman's body was taken away, leaving behind an unsettling silence that hung heavy in the air. The sheriff said they were trying to identify her, but they had no leads. No missing persons reports had been filed that matched her description. As the sun rose, casting its golden rays through the windows of the diner, the scene of the previous night felt like a bad dream. The police left, their investigation ongoing. The truck stop was back to its usual routine, the bustle of hungry truck drivers replacing the eerie quiet of the night. But the image of the woman, her eyes blank, her face devoid of emotion, stayed with me. The haunting words of the man, "So quiet you can almost hear the angels singing," echoed in my mind. I tried to forget the encounter, to push it into the recesses of my memory. But it wouldn't go away. The silence, the woman's stillness, the man's frantic gaze, the ominous feeling that hung in the air, they all haunted me. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and uneasy days. I kept replaying the events of the night in my mind, searching for some clue, some explanation for what had happened. I wondered about the woman, about who she was, about what had happened to her. And I was consumed by the unsettling feeling that the entire event was just the tip of the iceberg, that there was something more, something darker lurking beneath the surface. The police investigation didn't yield many results. They found no witnesses, no leads, and no sign of the man who had been with the woman. The woman was never identified, and her death remained a mystery. But I couldn't let go of it. I had to know what had happened. I had to find out who the woman was and what had happened to her. I started my own investigation, a desperate attempt to solve the puzzle that had taken hold of my mind. I talked to people in the town, asked around at the truck stops, and even contacted the local newspaper. I scoured the internet, searching for any information that might lead me to the woman. But my efforts were met with dead ends. Months went by, and the mystery of the woman in the car continued to haunt me. I couldn't escape the feeling that there was something more to it, something that I was missing. Then, one day, as I was working my shift at the truck stop, I saw him again. It was late at night, the same time of the night as the previous encounter. The truck stop was quiet. Only a handful of truck drivers were around, and the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and greasy fries. He walked through the door, his face still obscured by the shadows of his hat. He looked different, older, his eyes more tired, but I recognized him instantly. He looked around, his eyes scanning the room, searching for something, and when he saw me, his eyes widened, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He approached the counter, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. My heart pounded in my chest, my palms grew clammy, and my throat tightened. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. He didn't speak, just stared at me, as if searching for something in my eyes. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He continued to stare at me, his lips moving silently as if he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Finally, he spoke, his voice strained, his words barely audible. "I'm sorry, I have to tell you something." He hesitated, his eyes darting around, as if searching for an escape route. I didn't mean for it to happen. It was an accident. I was just trying to help her. I didn't want to." He stopped mid-sentence, his voice filled with anguish. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. I need to tell someone, to make things right. I can't live with this." He slumped forward, his shoulders shaking with sobs. He was a broken man, his facade of control crumbling under the weight of his guilt. I watched him, my heart aching for him, for the woman he had left behind, for the tragedy that had unfolded that night. I didn't know what to say, what to do. But something in his eyes, something in the way he was pleading with me, told me I couldn't walk away. "Tell me," I said, my voice soft, my words almost inaudible. I felt a wave of compassion wash over me, overriding the fear that had been gnawing at me for months. I listened as he poured out his story, his voice trembling, his words broken by sobs. He told me that he had been driving that night, heading to a nearby town to visit his sister. He had been driving for hours, his mind racing, his thoughts consumed by the problems in his life. He had been feeling lost, hopeless, as if he was drowning in a sea of despair. He was driving down a deserted highway, his headlights cutting through the darkness, when he saw her, standing by the side of the road, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with fear. He stopped his car, his instincts telling him to help. He got out of his car and approached her, asking if she was okay. She looked at him, her eyes filled with despair, and she told him that she was lost, that she had no one to turn to. He took her in, feeling a sense of obligation, a desire to help her, to make her feel safe. He drove her to the nearest town, which was the truck stop, and he told her he would help her get in touch with the authorities. He pulled into the parking lot, he got out of the car, and he went to the diner to get her some coffee. He left the woman in the car, her body stiff, her eyes staring straight ahead. By the time he came back, she was gone. She wasn't breathing. He was terrified. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how she had died. He panicked, he left the scene, and he drove away, feeling the weight of his guilt crushing him. He had been living with the guilt and fear ever since, he told me. He had tried to forget it, to bury it deep inside him, but it had been eating away at him, driving him to the brink of madness. He had come to confess, to tell someone, to try to make amends for what had happened. He handed me a small, worn wallet. "This is hers, I found it in her purse, I found it after I left." I took the wallet, my fingers trembling as I felt the leather beneath my touch. It was a simple wallet, but it felt heavy in my hands. I opened it, and inside, I found a driver's license, a few bills, and a single photograph of a happy, smiling woman. The woman's face stared back at me from the photo, her eyes bright with life, her smile radiating a warmth that seemed impossible given her fate. I looked at the man, his face etched with regret, a shadow of his former self. I saw a broken man, a man burdened by the weight of his guilt. I didn't know how it had happened, how the woman had died. I didn't know if the man had done anything wrong. But I knew that he was suffering, and I knew that he needed help. I didn't know what to say, how to respond. I felt a surge of emotions, a mixture of anger, sadness, and compassion. I felt an overwhelming sense of empathy, a desire to help him, to make him understand that he wasn't alone. I don't know what to say, I stammered. I need some time to think about this. He nodded silently, his face a mask of despair. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, begging me for forgiveness, for understanding. He left the diner, his shoulders slumped, his movements slow and heavy. I stood there, staring at the door, feeling the weight of the story he had told me. I looked at the wallet in my hands, at the photo of the woman, and I felt a sudden surge of determination. I had to know what had happened, I had to find out the truth. I picked up the phone, my fingers fumbling, and I dialed the sheriff's number. I told him what I had learned, what the man had confessed. He listened intently, his voice tight and serious. He told me that he would come to the truck stop, to talk to me, to hear the full story. He told me to keep the man's confession a secret, to wait for him to arrive. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing, as I tried to make sense of everything that had unfolded. The encounter with the man, the woman's death, and the mystery that had haunted me for months, it all felt like a nightmare, a story that was too strange, too dark, to be true. But I knew that it was real. I knew that I had to do something, to help the man, to find out the truth about the woman.